This is a mega compilation of the most disturbing crimes that happened in several famous business locations. You can play it in the background, or fall asleep to, or do whatever. Starting with crimes that happened at Taco Bell. Around 7:19 p.m. on August 14, 2024, a 25-year-old woman named Megan Kellerman of Stowe, Ohio, pulled into the Taco Bell drive-thru on Graham Road with her dog Penny to pick up her order. It was a typical Wednesday evening, with people grabbing dinner after work and heading home. Megan was waiting in the drive-thru when a driver pulled in behind her, and suddenly he began honking at her, and moments later the driver even bumped the rear end of her car. Now the impact was minor, but it was more than enough to make her feel unsafe, so she acted accordingly. Frightened, she called her father to explain things, but little did she know that things were about to go from bad to worse. Megan, who just graduated with her MBA from Cleveland State University in May of 2024, was described as the kind of person who liked helping others and constantly volunteered with Girls on the Run of Northeast Ohio, a youth program that mentors young girls through running and building confidence. Now the man who drove in behind her was 53-year-old Jason Williams, and according to witnesses at the scene, Jason immediately became agitated while Megan was placing her order, and then suddenly rammed his vehicle into hers. Now Megan realized that she wasn't just dealing with an angry person, but someone who was actually dangerous, and what made her situation even worse was the fact that she just couldn't leave. You see, this Taco Bell drive-thru had a serious design problem. It was a one-lane road with a high curb on one side and a steep drop on the other, which means that there was literally no way for Megan to escape. She couldn't drive around the cars in front of her, and she couldn't back up because Jason was right behind her, and she couldn't pull off to the side because of the curb. Instead, she used the drive-thru intercom to urgently ask the Taco Bell employees to call 911, after which she called her dad. Now during that call, Megan explained that some guy had hit her car and was acting crazy, and that she couldn't leave because he was boxed in. And while Nicholas Kielman, Megan's dad, was still on the phone with his daughter, he suddenly heard her scream.
And the last thing you hear on the telephone is your daughter screaming, he is out of the car. And then I hear a pop. So I'm yelling through the phone, Megan, talk to me.
Jason had gotten out of his vehicle, walked up to Megan's side window with a handgun, and fired 2 shots at point-blank range. But Jason wasn't done yet. After shooting Megan, he calmly walked back to his own car, got inside, and placed a gun under his chin, and then left this earth on his own. Everything happened so fast that the people at the Taco Bell parking lot didn't know what to do, but a handful of witnesses saw what happened and immediately dialed 911. Now, police reports indicate that dispatchers received at least 14 separate emergency calls about the shooting, and one of those calls went like this.
I'm at the Taco Bell on Graham Road and Hudson Drive, and a man just shot somebody and then shot himself in the head.
Now paramedics were dispatched shortly afterwards, but reaching the drive-thru was actually pretty difficult. The single lane left emergency vehicles trapped behind cars, and unable to drive up where the incident had occurred, paramedics were forced to park nearby and run the rest of the way, adding crucial seconds before they could actually reach the injured. And despite their efforts, it was already too late. According to the Summit County Medical Examiner, Megan was shot in the neck, causing fatal injuries, and so both Megan and Jason were pronounced dead at the scene. Now law enforcement officials immediately secured the area and called in the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation to assist. This is because homicides in Stowe are extremely rare. Now the officers also safely removed Megan's dog, Penny, from the passenger seat, after which they proceeded to search Jason's car, where they found some alcohol and a loaded gun. As investigators dug into Jason's background, it became clear that this wasn't just a random guy having a bad day. He had a history that should have kept him far from a gun, and multiple warning signs that somehow went ignored. Jason lived in Cuyahoga Falls and apparently had a long history of alcohol-related offenses and weapons charges. One of these incidents was in 1994, when Jason ran his car into the ditch on the East Pioneer Trail in Aurora, and when police tried to help, they discovered Jason drunk and carrying a .44 caliber revolver inside his car. He was charged with his first DUI, which led to his license being suspended, and when the case went to trial, a Portage County grand jury indicted Jason on a charge of carrying a concealed weapon. And a couple of months later, Jason was picked up again by Stowe police for driving, even though his license was still suspended from the DUI. However, the court records show that he cut a deal with the prosecutors, who eventually dropped the charge, and instead of facing serious consequences, Jason simply pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges. He paid the fines and then got on with his life. And fast forward to 2023, and things get even worse. On April 19th, Aurora police found Jason drunk after a wreck. This time, the 52-year-old was driving a motorcycle, a 2000 Indian to be exact, and official police records say that Jason first crashed a bike into a brick sign at the Aurora gas station, where he had coincidentally bought a bottle of vodka earlier in the evening. Jason was then taken to the hospital, but he refused to provide a blood sample to test his alcohol level. But the police said that they smelled alcohol on him at the scene and charged him with drunk driving, and immediately suspended his license again. But in September of 2023, Jason cut a deal and avoided a drunk driving conviction by pleading guilty to again a misdemeanor charge of losing physical control of his motorcycle. And by this point, his records showed a clear pattern. He gets drunk, drives his vehicle with a loaded weapon, gets caught, pleads guilty to something less severe, and repeats it all over again. But then, just a few months before the Taco Bell shooting, Jason was arrested again. And this time, what happened was serious enough that it should have kept him locked up, or at least permanently disarmed. Because on March 26, 2024, 2024, which was less than 5 months before he killed Megan, Jason was pulled over by Hudson police after he was caught driving the wrong way down a one-way street at night.
Stop the car. What are you doing? Put your hands on the wheel for me. Put your hands on the wheel. On the wheel. What are you doing, sir? You're driving the wrong way on a one-way street. What are you doing?
And when the officers approached his vehicle, they immediately detected a strong odor of alcohol. They asked Jason where he was headed, but he appeared confused and was unable to respond clearly. Now, the arrest report stated that Jason was severely impaired, very unstable on his feet, and slurring his words. And at one point during the stop, he admitted to the officers that he had, quote, drunk enough to be bad that night.
Okay, how much have you had to drink tonight? Enough to be bad?
Now, during that stop, the police found again a loaded .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol in Jason's vehicle, along with a spare loaded magazine. They also found a nearly empty bottle of Captain Morgan rum and a cup of clear liquid in the console.
Watch your step there. There's a curb here. We're gonna go on this sidewalk right over here, okay?
Okay.
Can you stand right here in front of me?
Sure.
And face toward me, okay? Alright. You okay?
Yeah, I'm good.
Jason was then charged with operating a vehicle under the influence, improper handling of a firearm in a vehicle, which is a felony, and several other offenses. And in April of 2024, a grand jury indicted him on these charges. But instead of being held in jail, Jason was released in May of 2024 on a $5,000 bond. Now, as part of his release conditions, he was restricted from owning any firearms. He was also ordered to get a scram alcohol monitoring bracelet, which is a device you wear on your ankle that detects if you've been drinking. However, Jason never actually got the scram bracelet, nor did he dispose of any of his guns. He simply didn't do them, and apparently nobody checked to make sure he complied with the court order. Now, surprisingly, records showed that 2 months before the March 2024 incident, Jason tried to get help for his dangerous behavior. In January of 2024, he actually called the mental health hotline and informed the person who answered that he was planning to check himself out of this world. And shortly after, local authorities were dispatched to his home for a wellness check. And when they arrived, they found Jason in what they described as a mental health crisis. Officers said that he was drinking wine straight from the bottle, and he even described to them a specific plan he had to unalive himself using 2 of his guns. Now, normally when police run into someone who is clearly falling apart, there are clear ways to intervene. Perhaps take him to a hospital, perform a psych evaluation, or maybe just remove the weapons. But none of that actually happened, and it wasn't really their choice. Ohio doesn't have a red flag law, which means that police or family can't actually ask a judge to temporarily take someone's guns, even if that person is clearly a danger to himself or others. So despite these warning signs, there was no legal way to actually remove Jason's firearms without his consent. Now, the police officers found an open treatment spot for him in Indiana, and they took him at his word that he would go there. Now, the really questionable part here is that there was no follow-up to make sure that he actually got treatment or that his guns were actually removed from his home. And that's how we got to this tragic situation. Now, 4 days after the Taco Bell shooting, hundreds of people gathered on the front lawn of Stowe City Hall for a candlelight vigil in Megan's honor. And the same month, Megan's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit arguing her death could have been prevented. But as of now, the lawsuit names only Jason Williams' estate as a defendant, and no other person or organization have been added yet. Now, fortunately, a year after Megan's death, Ohio Senator Casey Weinstein introduced a bill called the Megan's Way Out. And basically, this bill requires new drive-thrus to have an escape lane, so drivers aren't actually trapped in emergency situations. And as heartbreaking as Megan's story is, this next case is even more unsettling, because this time there were no warning signs at all. On November 9, 2022, just after noon in Scott Township, Pennsylvania, 32-year-old Dorian Carver walked out of the Taco Bell on Cochran Road, where he'd been working his shift. Now, a few minutes earlier, he and his manager, 23-year-old Zaire Simmons, had gotten into a heated argument inside the restaurant, loud enough that customers in the dining room could actually hear them. So as Dorian walked out of the building and headed down to Cochran Road, Zaire followed him outside. And what happened next turned a bad day at work into a case that Allegheny County would never forget. And before we get into what happened next, it helps to understand who Dorian was. Born on November 1st, 1990, Dorian lived in Natrona Heights in Harrison Township, just outside Pittsburgh. He was the son of Richard Carver and Carmela Wilson. His siblings, Chiffon Carver and Jerail Carver, said Dorian was caring and the kind of brother who would drop everything to help others. His mother, Carmela, said he was a protector and a beloved son, someone their family was deeply proud of. He worked at the Taco Bell on Cochran Road, and by all accounts, he showed up, did his job, and avoided any major issues. Zaire, on the other hand, was younger, only 23 at the time, and his background was very different from Dorian's. According to records, he grew up in foster care and moved between homes throughout his childhood. And by his teenage years, he'd already seen repeated violence, as he witnessed a shooting at a playground in Pittsburgh's Homewood neighborhood. He also lost his older brother and his best friend to violence. And despite all that, Zaire worked his way up at the Taco Bell on Cochrane Road, eventually becoming a shift manager, which meant that he had authorities over other employees, including Dorian. But outside of work, their dynamic looked very different. Despite being Dorian's manager, Zaire depended on him and his fiancée, who we're going to be calling Jenna. Zaire needed rides to work and home after his shifts. This act of generosity to Zaire, however, wouldn't stop what happened between them on November 9th, 2022. That morning started like any other. Customers came in and out, and orders went out as usual, until around noon, when Zaire handed Dorian a written warning for a policy violation. Now, the exact details of this warning were never made public, but whatever was written on that paper made Dorian really angry, and the two men started arguing inside the restaurant, and according to witnesses, it didn't stay verbal for long. Dorian shoved Zaire, who shoved back, and two line cooks quickly stepped in to pull them apart before things escalated. Now, once they were separated, Dorian walked out of the Taco Bell completely, heading down Cochrane Road toward the Northwestern Mutual building. He tried to get away from the argument and walked into the Northwestern Mutual's lobby to call Jenna for a ride, as he'd left his phone at Taco Bell. But before he could actually make the call, Zaire walked in right behind him with his hand tucked inside his jean jacket, and inside that lobby, the argument resumed right where it left off. And then Zaire pulled out a .40 caliber handgun, loaded the chamber, and fired. Dorian was shot twice before he collapsed on the tile floor. Zaire then turned and fled the scene, gun still in hand. Now, the first 911 calls came within seconds. Scott Township police officers arrived first and found Dorian in the lobby, where he was immediately pronounced dead. And because the shooter, Zaire, fled, the response quickly escalated into a large search for an armed suspect. And so multiple departments, including SWAT, moved in, while nearby schools like Lincoln Elementary, Jefferson Elementary, and Jefferson Middle School were placed on lockdown. Even people at the Bethel Church and the nearby Giant Eagle store were told to remain indoors. Now, not long after that, Allegheny County Police arrived and took over the homicide investigation. And as the search expanded, Mount Lebanon Police also pushed out a suspect description. And seeing countless officers searching for an armed shooter had locals worried for their safety.
They had rifles, AK-47s, which was, I thought something really bad was happening.
Fortunately, staff at Northwestern Mutual confirmed that none of their employees or clients were hurt. Now, later on, police would recover the .40 caliber handgun used in the shooting behind a vacant building next to the Northwestern Mutual office. And forensic testing later confirmed that the gun matched the shell casings recovered at the scene, leading detectives to believe that Zaire simply dropped it there as he ran. Now, despite all the witnesses' accounts and the gun being recovered, hours passed, and there was still no sign of Zaire. Then, around 7:45 that evening, roughly 7.5 hours after the shooting, Zaire walked into an Allegheny County Police Station and turned himself in, though his reason for surrendering wasn't actually announced to the public.
We're just still like in shock, because here he went to work. All he did is go to work. And then for him to end up dead at work, it makes no sense.
Zaire was charged with criminal homicide, but that wasn't actually all. Detectives also traced the .40 caliber pistol and found it had been reported stolen. So Zaire also received separate firearm-related offenses, including receiving stolen property and carrying a firearm without a license. And so on January 13, 2023, about 2 months after the shooting, Zaire appeared in district court for his preliminary hearing, where prosecutors were expected to present enough evidence for the charges to move forward. However, Zaire waived his rights to the hearing, so all charges against him went straight to trial. And during the hearing, members of Dorian's family were present in the courtroom. This included his aunt, Adrienne Young, who understood this laws better than most. She was a victim advocate and the director of Tree of Hope, a faith-based anti-violence organization in Pittsburgh, which she founded more than 20 years earlier after her own son was killed. He was just 18.
The ultimate justice is for him to never, ever see daylight again. For him to think about what he did every day that he's in that jail cell.
Now, 4 weeks later, on February 14th, Zaire was arraigned in common pleas court and pleaded not guilty. Now, his defense team actually didn't dispute Zaire firing the gun. In fact, Zaire actually admitted on the stand that he shot Dorian, but his defense team centered its case on the fear, arguing that Zaire thought Dorian was reaching for a weapon and fired because he believed he was about to be attacked. And according to Zaire's testimony, by the time they reached the Northwestern Mutual building, Dorian's hands were in his waistband, and Zaire believed Dorian might actually be hiding a weapon. But during the trial, the gun charges actually started falling apart. Jared Caruso charged Zaire with receiving stolen property for the gun and carrying a firearm without actually having a license. But when it came to present evidence on those accounts, Jared had nothing. He admitted in court that he'd been waiting for evidence that never arrived in time. He said he believed they might be able to find the person the gun was stolen from, but that never came through. And because of these, the defense moved to strike both gun counts. And the judge actually granted the motion and complained to Jared, saying, "When I'm telling a jury that Mr. Simmons is being charged with the gun being stolen and they're just hoping and guessing and praying that you're going to produce a witness, that is not a way this is supposed to happen. And the jury was then told to disregard the gun charges, and they only focused on the homicide count alone. And after only 9 hours, they reached a verdict. On February 4th, 2025, the jury found Zaire guilty of first-degree murder, and under Pennsylvania law, that conviction carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without parole. And so on May 1st, 2025, Judge Beamer handed down the sentence, and Zaire was taken into custody to begin serving life without parole. And for Dorian's family, it looked like justice had been finally served after 2.5 years of waiting. But a month later, everything fell apart. In June, Zaire's new attorney, Ryan James, filed a motion for a new trial. He argued that even though the gun charges were dropped, the damage was already done. The jury had heard from the very beginning that Zaire was charged with carrying a stolen gun. Information had painted him as dishonest and dangerous before a single piece of evidence was presented, and James argued that this kind of prejudice couldn't be erased just by telling the jury to forget about it. And so in August of 2025, Judge Beamer agreed. He set aside Zaire's conviction and ordered a new trial. Dorian's family was devastated when they got the news.
Like, we were just starting to calm down and settle down and start to grieve our son, and now all of a sudden that little band-aid that got over the gaping wound is just ripped off.
And so after a lot of back and forth, a new trial date was set for February 17th, 2026, where Judge Beamer would decide if Zaire got another trial or if his case would be dismissed completely. And so nearly 3 years after Dorian was shot and killed while trying to walk away from a workplace argument, his family is still waiting to see if Zaire could get out of prison because of a prosecutor's negligence, leaving them with no justice. Unlike this case, which ended in a surrender within hours, the next one turned into a full-blown manhunt that had civilians fearing for their lives. On the evening of November 10th, 2015, Jeanette Pokes was at home with her boyfriend, Elton David Croquette, when he left to meet someone about a jewelry deal. She told him not to go because something about it just didn't feel right. He seemed uneasy too, because before walking out the door, he took off most of the jewelry he normally wore and grabbed a gun instead. Jeanette warned him again, but he simply brushed it off and promised that he would be back soon. Little did she know that nothing would be the same after that night. David was a 48-year-old man who lived in Louisville, Kentucky. He fathered 3 daughters from a previous relationship, Charlissa, Jessica, and Elizabeth. He was also a grandfather to another kid named Emma Rose. Now during the week, David worked at the Essex Nursing and Rehabilitation Center, looking after elderly residents and rehab patients. David's co-workers described him as gentle and the kind of guy who kept his head down. But on weekends, David worked at the flea market. Every Saturday and Sunday, he set up a booth at Derby Park Flea Market, a large outdoor market where vendors sold everything from antiques and electronics to used items. There, he actually sold gold chains, rings, watches, and other jewelry, while also buying old pieces from people to resell for profit. Now, vendors described David as friendly and easygoing, so it wasn't unusual for him to meet buyers or sellers outside the market when it was more convenient. And on Tuesday, November 10th, 2015, David arranged a jewelry meetup with several people. He contacted one of the buyers the day before at the flea market, and they chose a Taco Bell on Dixie Highway to handle the transaction. Now, this particular Taco Bell was located in the Valley Station area, a busy, well-lit spot where cars came through and people went in and out. The parking lot circled the building, and on the side, away from the drive-thru, there was just a small waiting area. And it was there around 7:30 p.m. that customers in the drive-thru, people in parked cars, and staff inside the restaurant heard 3 loud shots and froze. And when people nearby realized someone had been shot, 911 calls started going out almost immediately. Louisville Metro police officers and emergency services rushed to the scene, and when they arrived, he was found lying in the parking lot. David had been shot multiple times with a pool of blood beneath him, and he was hardly breathing. Emergency services did everything they could, but a few minutes later, David was pronounced dead. The managers at the Taco Bell restaurant locked their doors to keep the customers safe, while police set up the crime scene tape and closed off sections of the parking lot. Meanwhile, detectives photographed the scenes while officers moved through the lot, cataloging every shell casing across the pavement. And by the next morning, Louisville Metro Police confirmed that they were investigating a homicide. Detectives were going door to door asking questions, talking to anyone who might have been near the Taco Bell the night before, and they pulled the surveillance footage from nearby businesses, hoping that someone's camera had caught a car leaving or a person running away, but they actually found nothing. Now, what the police didn't say publicly though was that they already had leads. They arrived at 2 names, 39-year-old Larry Caffey and 34-year-old Angela Tingle, and so the police began tracking down Larry and Angela, but they refused to tell the press how they figured out the pair was connected to David. And 3 days later, on November 13th, around 11:30 a.m., Louisville Metro Police spotted a vehicle on Westport Road with Larry and Angela inside, so they moved in to stop it. But instead of pulling over, Larry, who was driving, hit the gas and took off, and officers chased him all the way to a shopping shopping center near St. Matthews. Now during the pursuit, Larry rammed 2 police cruisers and hit a parked vehicle. Now he kept driving into St. Matthews before the chase ended on Delgeorge Drive when the car crashed behind a home. Now the duo ran from the car and forced their way into a nearby house to hide, and since officers couldn't pinpoint their exact location, they brought in K9 units to help with their search. Schools in the area went on lockdown as residents watched from their windows fearing for their lives, while the officers searched front lawns, porches, and backyards. And the entire search lasted into the early afternoon, before Larry and Angela were found hiding inside a home and taken into custody around 1:30 p.m. However, the charges they were arrested for weren't for David's murder. Instead, the police brought them in because they knew that the duo had information about what happened in the Taco Bell parking lot, though neither of them were actually the shooter, which meant whoever pulled the trigger was still out there. And according to Angela's statement to the police, she wasn't present when the shooting happened. Larry actually drove a car to meet David in the Taco Bell parking lot with a 47-year-old man named Dennis Ray Stinnett and an unidentified woman in the backseat. Larry told her that David got into the front seat of the car with the jewelry and after a few moments pulled a gun on Dennis. And according to Larry, this actually caused Dennis to react first and shoot David. However, before this incident, Dennis already had a long criminal history, going back decades, including burglary, robbery, and multiple drug offenses. Detectives recovered $62,500 in stolen jewelry before he was convicted and sent to prison. And so now, using Angela's statement and his prior record, police tracked Dennis down later that day, arrested him, and charged him with David's murder. His .45 caliber handgun was recovered, and Dennis admitted that it was the gun used to kill David. And so in total, he was charged with murder, tampering with physical evidence, possession of a handgun by a convicted felon, and possession of a defaced firearm. His bond was set to $100,000. And so the arrest gave David's family a brief sense of relief. On Saturday, November 14, 2015, family and friends gathered to honor David. His funeral was held in Campbellsville, the town where he grew up, with his family and close friends in attendance. Now the very next day, Dennis made his first court appearance. And despite the initial murder charge, the case didn't actually go to trial. Instead, it moved through the court system for more than 2 years before Dennis took a plea deal. Dennis claimed that David pulled a gun on him first, creating uncertainty about how the shooting actually unfolded. And so those questions actually made it difficult for prosecutors to prove intent to kill. And so as a result, the murder charge was reduced. And so on April 26, 2018, Dennis ultimately pled guilty to second-degree manslaughter instead. Now Larry was also booked for 16 counts, including 3 of reckless endangerment of police officers, assault, and actually methamphetamine possession, while Angela was charged with burglary and possession of drug items. But our next story is even more shocking, eventually becoming one of the deadliest hostage situations in American history. On the morning of January 26, 1991, just before 1 a.m., a Taco Bell on Valley View Lane, Irving, Texas, was closing for the night. Inside the building were 3 employees: Teresa Fraga, 23-year-old Frank Fraga, and 28-year-old Michael John Peelan. What none of them realized, however, is that in a matter of minutes, that morning would take a very disturbing turn. Teresa lived in Irving, Texas, and worked as a crew member at Taco Bell on Valley View Lane. She was already raising a 1-year-old daughter, and at the time, she was 4 months pregnant with her second child. Now she came in for a shift that evening, where her 23-year-old cousin Frank Fraga worked alongside her. Now Frank lived in Dallas, Texas, but he and Teresa were close, and the job at Taco Bell gave them a chance to spend time as a family, while they also earned a paycheck. Now Frank was very friendly, and his close friends described him as someone who showed up on time and did the work without complaint. Frank was really known for a strong work ethic, but when it actually came to closing up the restaurant each night, that responsibility usually fell to Michael, because he was actually the assistant manager and lived in Fort Worth, Texas. Now Michael had worked his way up in the company and took his job seriously. Now less than a mile away, 19-year-old Jesse Carlos San Miguel drove through Irving and headed towards the same Taco Bell restaurant. Now Jesse had actually dropped out of school in 10th grade and was well known to local police because he'd been arrested 9 times and had even been accused of shooting a man. But despite all of that, he still applied for a job at the same Taco Bell and had been turned down. Now inside that Taco Bell, 17-year-old Jerome Mike Green was also worked part-time there and was a close friend of Teresa, but his shift ended around 11 p.m. And after Jerome clocked out and left for the night, the remaining employees began their usual closing routine. The 3 cleaned the kitchen, locked the front doors, closed the registers, and gathered the night's cash. Now Michael was responsible for the time lock safe, which was programmed to open only at a set time, which meant that he had to wait a while for it to open before actually storing the money inside. Now while the trio cleaned up, Seung Chang Wing, a family friend of the Fragas, parked outside and waited to give them a ride home, completely unaware that danger was actually very nearby. Because less than 100 feet away from him, Jerome actually met with Jesse outside the building, who parked nearby, and together they waited for an opportunity to actually break into the restaurant. And the opportunity came when one of the 3 opened the back door to take out the trash, and when the door swung open, the duo forced their way into the building, armed with guns and masks to protect their identity. It was pretty much an inside that job. Now once inside, they rounded up the employees and forced Michael to stand at the safe, making him wait for the time lock mechanism to release so it could be opened. And while they waited, one of them took Teresa and Frank to the back of the restaurant and forced them into the walk-in freezer. Now one of them actually noticed someone waiting in his car, so they also forced them out at gunpoint, marched them inside, and shoved them into the freezer with Teresa and Frank. Now when the time lock safe finally opened, Michael handed over the cash and was also forced into the freezer. The total amount they stole was approximately $1,390, which they then stuffed into Taco Bell takeout bags before leaving the restaurant. Now a few minutes after they left, Jesse actually turned around and went back inside. He walked to the freezer, pulled the door open, and looked at the 4 people huddled inside. Then he asked them to give him one good reason why he shouldn't kill them. And when no one actually gave him the answer he was looking for, he pulled out a 9mm pistol and fired. Now 4 hours later, around 5 AM, Irving police spotted a pickup truck moving oddly less than a mile from the Taco Bell on Valley View Lane. They pulled it over outside a convenience store based on suspicion that the driver was drunk. And during the stop, one officer actually noticed a Taco Bell takeout sack on the front seat stuffed with wads of cash. And after a brief search of the truck, officers found 2 stocking masks, 2 pairs of gloves, a jammed 9mm automatic pistol that smelled like it had been fired recently, and a large amount of cash stuffed inside another Taco Bell bag. Now Jesse and Jerome were arrested for reckless driving, suspicion of drunk driving, and driving with an expired inspection sticker. But despite only being arrested for that, the officers still radioed in the drunk drivers and the stolen cash. And they began checking Taco Bell restaurants in Irving. And since the fast food chain had 6 restaurants in the city at the time, investigators made calls and drove to each location. And so in the early hours of the same day, Captain TJ Hall and other officers arrived at the Valley View Lane location and found it to be closed. The front doors were locked, the lights were off, and of course no one was able to answer when they knocked. Now the officers then actually decided to break in through the drive-thru window, and this is where they found the registers to be closed and the kitchen clean. But when they walked toward the back of the restaurant and opened the walk-in freezer, they saw all 4 inside, shot in the head, lying in a massive pool of blood. Michael and Frank had each been shot twice in the back of the head. Teresa, who was again 4 months pregnant, had also been shot twice. Sid had been shot in the shoulder, but the bullet actually traveled through his neck and exited near his nose. Now after the discovery, the officers immediately secured the scene and called for homicide detectives. And within hours, investigators swarmed the restaurant. They photographed the crime scene and collected all the evidence they needed. And back at the police station, the detectives then began interrogating Jerome and Jesse, but neither of them really talked.
Officers finding suspects before they trace their alleged victims. Police were led to the murder scene by a traffic stop at this intersection several blocks from the restaurant.
Now because of this, investigators moved quickly to search Jesse's home in Irving, where they recovered items linking him to the crime, including clothing with gunpowder residue. Now while authorities worked to build their case, the effects of the crime was actually felt by many people across Irving and the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The families of the 4 held vigils and funerals in their memory. Now especially Teresa, because of her age, her pregnancy, and the fact that she was already a mother, drew strong support and anger from the public, which actually prompted many people to be furious when they learned that Jesse had been freed on a $45,000 bond for existing weapons and burglary charges at the time of the murders. Now fortunately, once local authorities had enough evidence, Jesse and Jerome were formally charged with 4 counts of capital murder, 1 for each victim, and were held without bail. Now because Jerome was 17 at the time of the murders, he couldn't actually receive the death penalty under Texas law. Now under the felony murder rule, his participation in the robbery made him equally responsible for what happened inside. And so in 1992, he pleaded guilty to capital murder in exchange for a reduced sentence. He received a 50-year prison term and became eligible for parole in 2004 after serving only about 13 years. However, being eligible didn't actually mean he could be released, and he actually remained incarcerated after his parole was denied. And so under the terms of the sentence, he won't be expected to complete his full term until 2042. However, this wasn't the same for Jesse. He was already 19, and so his trial with the charges of 4 counts of capital murder took place in 1991. Now at the time, Texas Attorney General John Kernan presented the public and jury with extensive evidence of violent behavior, including a testimony that Jesse had actually threatened a classmate with a knife before later knocking him unconscious. He also shot another student in the stomach before a confrontation, shot into a teenager's home after a dispute, and repeatedly took part in violent fights he often started. And so after a brief discussion, the jury actually voted for the death penalty. And so Judge Harold Enns formally sentenced Jesse to death. Now Jesse of course appealed his conviction and argued that racial stereotyping influenced his death sentence. And during a death row interview, he said, "The evidence is so obvious that I had a very unfair trial. They did not base the decision on my history or my individuality. It was based on me being a Mexican. There's nothing I could do to stop what happened. People react in the heat of the moment. When something happens out of instinct, we just do it. We don't do it out of intent. We don't do it on purpose. It just happens. However, of course, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rejected his claims and left his conviction and death sentence in place. And so on June 29, 2000, nearly 9.5 years after the murders, Jesse Carlos San Miguel, 28 now, was executed by lethal injection. The execution took place in Huntsville, Texas. As 6 members of his victims' families watched him die, he was pronounced dead at 6:19 p.m. But the next Taco Bell case would grow into one of Georgia's most fiercely disputed murder convictions. Donna Brown was 40 years old, and everything in her life revolved around her 7-year-old son. As a single mother in Georgia, she raised him and paid the bills, and she spent most of her time working in the fast food industry, trying to give her son a better life. Now, by September of 1998, her dedication had finally paid off, and she was promoted to night manager at the local Taco Bell, putting her in charge of closing the restaurant each night. Now, on the morning of September 19, 1998, Donna was closing the restaurant only for the second time at the location. She was still learning the routine, including taking the day's deposit to the bank drop box down the road. Now, around 2 a.m., Donna finished counting the money and sealed $1,732 in a deposit bag, and she walked outside her car with the bag in her hand. However, an unknown man was waiting near the entrance, tucked into a corner. He let her get close, came up behind her, and hit her on the head. Donna immediately dropped to the pavement, and while she was barely conscious, the masked man shot her, grabbed the cash and her keys, and then drove away. Now, when Donna failed to return home after a shift, her close relatives contacted local authorities, and within a few hours, officers arrived at the Taco Bell and discovered that she'd been shot once through her right eye, with the open deposit bag beside her. They also realized that her car was missing, and so they immediately began searching the surrounding area for the stolen vehicle, and shortly after, they found the car abandoned in the parking lot of a closed restaurant, which had been damaged after it was driven into a chain link fence at the entrance. Now, after the initial investigation, police returned Donna's car to her family, and it was then that the relative actually noticed a homemade ski mask still inside, one that police had somehow overlooked, and so they alerted investigators who collected it and logged it into evidence. Now, in the small town Adel that they lived in, a murder as public and brutal as Donna's placed immediate pressure on the police to solve the case fast. Now, Agent Jamie Steinberg led the investigation as the police interviewed employees as well as witnesses and began working through what little evidence they actually had. And within actually 24 hours, a local drug dealer named Zachary Payne told investigators to look into a man named Devonia Inman. He didn't actually know him well, but Devonia had pointed a gun at him just days before the murder, and Zachary thought he was capable of something like this. Now, investigators also spoke to Larissa Chapman, who'd been working the closing shift that night. Now, she initially told them that she'd seen nothing unusual outside the restaurant, but 5 days later, after a suspect had already been taken into custody, investigators returned to re-interview witnesses, and when they got back to Larissa, she said that while waiting in the parking lot for a ride, she'd heard a voice coming from nearby bushes and recognized it as Devonia's. She described the man as bald and wearing a white tank top. Now, Devonia Inman was 20 years old and had only been in Adel for about 2 months. He was the father of a young boy, Trevensky Jackson, and in 1998, he moved from California after his mother, Dina Ray, sent him to live with relatives, hoping to pull him away from the troublesome company he was keeping back at home. Now, he'd actually already previously pleaded guilty in 1995 to a felony charge of making terroristic threats, and fast forward to September 21st, 1998, 2 days after the murder, the police actually decided to arrest Devonia at his aunt's house, but actually on an outstanding probation violation. And while he was in custody, 3 more people came forward and gave statements placing him at the center of the case. Marquetta Thomas, the sister of Devonia's girlfriend, told investigators that on the day of the murder, Devonia came to her house, acting nervous and strange. She said that his clothes had blood on him and that he carried a large amount of cash. Then investigators heard from Kwame Spalding, an inmate who shared a cell with Devonia after his arrest. Kwame actually told investigators that Devonia had confessed while they were locked up together. Kwame said Devonia described hiding in the bushes and waiting for Donna to come out, and according to him, Devonia said he tried to grab the deposit bag and then shot Donna with a revolver. And finally, Virginia Tatum, a newspaper carrier, told investigators that she drove her delivery route near the Taco Bell before dawn on September 19th, and according to her, she saw Donna's car speeding away from the area and said that she got a clear look at the driver. Now, Virginia said the driver abandoned Donna's car and left in a second vehicle with a different person inside, but instead of opening a case for the driver that aided his escape, the state simply used their claim to strengthen its case against Devonia. And with all those statements in hand, the prosecution charged Devonia with murder, armed robbery, theft, and a gun charge, which was based entirely on the allegation that he'd used a firearm during Donna's murder and that as a convicted felon, he wasn't permitted to possess one. And this is where it gets interesting. The trial began on June 11, 2001, and District Attorney Catherine Harris Helms and Assistant District Attorney Kimberly Whiddon opened for the state, citing Devonia Inman's 1995 felony conviction to tell the jury why he couldn't actually legally own a gun, and then moved on to the crime scene evidence. Now, the medical examiner examiner testified that Donna was shot while she was on the ground, with the muzzle about a feet from her head when the gun was fired. And the bullet that came from the scene came from a .44 special revolver. But when the witnesses actually took stand, suddenly the story began to fall apart. First, Marquetta confessed that basically I made the entire story up just to get him out of the picture, because Marquetta actually wanted to keep her sister from Devonia and thought that getting him in trouble with the police would do that.
So you made it up?
Basically, I made it up. Yeah, just to get him out the picture, because I was so hurt and crushed, because she still really wanted to be with him. She liked him, and I'm like, I can't stand let this dude just beat on my baby sister.
She also said that investigators kept coming to her job, taking her out to eat, riding around with her. And at 18 or 19, she got caught up in it. But now that it was 3 years later, and she'd been incarcerated herself, sitting in county jail while Devonia's trial was underway, she began to understand what she'd done. Now, Larisha also took back her statements, telling the jury she was just making that up because she was tired of detectives calling her. Now, already 2 of the 4 witnesses had just admitted under oath, but Kwame and Virginia actually stayed true to their original statements. And yet, even after Marquetta and Larisha backed away from their stories, the prosecutors told the jury to trust what they first told police. And under Georgia's law, those earlier statements could actually still be treated as evidence. But Devonia's defense team, including attorney Melinda Riles, decided to go for a different story. They argued that the real killer was someone who actually worked at the Taco Bell with Don. His name was Hercules Brown, who, despite sharing her last name, had no relation with Don. And his defense team actually found 3 witnesses who were willing to testify that Hercules recruited them to help with the robbery. And so during the trial, they filed motions and raised the issue with the court. But when it actually came to it, it was ruled against the defense and the testimony was kept out. And so on June 25th, 2001, the jury returned guilty verdicts. And the next day, Devonia was sentenced to life without parole. Now, the conviction gave Donna's Brown family a sense of closure. But for Dina, Devonia's mother, the verdict was heartbreaking because she truly believed that the state had convicted the wrong man. I want justice for my son. I pray to God that I'm alive to see him walk out of prison a free man. But after sentencing, Devonia was transferred to Augusta State Medical Prison to begin serving his time. His son Travinsky was still an infant and too young to actually understand where his father had gone or why. And as the years passed, Travinsky grew up around prison visits, and he sat across from Devonia in visiting rooms and spoke to him through the glass. But the story doesn't actually end here. 213 days before the trial ever began, on November 10, 2000, while Devonia sat in jail waiting for his trial, another man walked into Bennett's grocery in the middle of the day. The owner, William Carroll Bennett, was behind the counter. He was the person the store was named after, and in a town that small, most people knew exactly who he was. Now, also working that day was a clerk named Rebecca Ann Browning. Now, the man who walked into the store had an accomplice, Wesley Mason Jr., and together they came to rob the place. And moments after they entered the store, they picked up baseball bats and beat William Carroll Bennett and Rebecca Browning until they killed them. Now, a random customer, Wayne Peters, was also severely beat but barely survived. Now, within days, the police arrested the 2 men for the attack at Bennett's grocery. And the first man, Wesley, pleaded guilty and received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, the other man was Hercules Brown, and he also pleaded guilty and received the same sentence. This was the same Hercules that Devonia's team had tried to present as the real killer of Donna Brown. Now, after Devonia's conviction became final, his lawyers filed appeals and post-conviction motions over the years, arguing that the trial was unfair and that there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. But the court still denied each effort and left the conviction in place. And for more than a decade, nothing would change. But then in 2011, the Georgia Innocence Project, a non-profit that fights wrongful convictions, took the case. And fortunately for them, DNA testing had actually advanced since 1998, and so the attorneys focused on a key item from the original investigation, the ski mask found in Donna's car. And so they filed a motion to test it, and after a legal fight, the court actually granted the request. And later that year, the results came back, and the DNA on the inside of the mask matched Hercules. But the DNA result wasn't the worst of it. The state had actually known about Hercules all along, because in September of 2000, months before Devonia's trial and weeks before the Bennett's grocery murders, police pulled Hercules over outside a supermarket in Adel, and after searching his car, they found a gun and cocaine, and he was arrested and charged on these counts. And the police actually found 2 items in the trunk, a handgun and a homemade ski mask cut from fabric with eye holes. And the police actually also documented the stop and the items in a report, and under the Brady rule, the state had a duty to turn over evidence that could help the defense. But Devonia's team actually never saw it back then. It stayed buried for years until the defense pulled the police file during post-conviction work. And so Devonia's defense team went back to court seeking a new trial, and this time they called Hercules to the stand. But he of course refused to testify, and without Hercules actually saying anything in court, the state still argued that it didn't prove that Devonia was innocent, and so they kept pushing the idea that both men could have been involved. But in January of 2014, Kwame actually came forward saying, basically everything was coerced. The detective was telling me he'll let me go home and stuff to say about the man. And during this period, Lee Grimes, a former co-worker of Virginia Tatum, revealed that Virginia didn't actually go to the investigators until a month after the crime, when she discovered the $5,000 reward. Now, Now 2 years later, on February 24th, 2016, an investigative series by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution called DNA Denial brought the case to a much larger mainstream audience, and around the same time, Jessie Gabelsino became a visible part of Devonia's effort. She worked at the law school clinic at Georgia State University and collaborated with the Georgia Innocence Project, and she also visited Devonia in prison and brought law students into the work. And so by 2018, a new legal team had taken on Devonia's case, and they filed a legal request asking the court to review whether his continued imprisonment was lawful and whether he actually deserved relief. And so on September 19, 2019, the Georgia Supreme Court issued a decision that allowed Devonia's case to move forward. And with the case back in motion, the court then started looking hard at the physical evidence. And by June 2021, the judge finally treated the mask as strong evidence, tying it to Hercules. And so the court wanted to question him directly, and so they arranged to bring him out to testify while he was still in prison. But Hercules actually refused to leave his cell. Even if they forced him into the room, he would still refuse to answer on the record. So the testimony never even started. But 5 months later, Judge Christina ruled on the petition and granted Devonia a new trial because she found that the prosecutors actually violated his constitutional rights by not disclosing that Hercules had been arrested in September of 2000 with a similar homemade mask in his car. And so on September 20th, 2021, all of Devonia's charges were dropped. And so the same day, Devonia walked out of Augusta State Medical Prison after 23 years behind bars. He went in as a 20-year-old and walked out at 43. And waiting outside the prison were his mother, Dina Ray, and his son, Travinsky Jackson. He also had a granddaughter now, 3-year-old Alona. But in our next case, the truth comes out much faster. Yet what the killer did in those few hours made it even harder to forget. In January 1994, 19-year-old Courtney Matthews was serving at Fort Campbell, a military base on the Tennessee-Kentucky border just outside Clarksville. He lived in a duplex on Ryder Avenue with 2 other roommates, soldier Carl Ward and Carl's wife, Shante. Now Courtney actually needed money to make repairs on a friend's car, so he started looking for part-time work, and on January 19, 1994, he walked into the Taco Bell on Riverside Drive and applied for a job. Now the restaurant hired him as a crew member, and by that same week, he was working the late night shifts. Now 10 days into the job, on the night of January 29, 1994, Courtney clocked out of his shift at 9:11 p.m. while his colleagues stayed behind to finish up work. Amongst them were 22-year-old Kevin Campbell, who just got married and had a 2-week-old daughter, 22-year-old Angela Wyatt, and 39-year-old Patricia Mae Price, who was a mother of 5 who had only been married 3 months and had recently moved to Clarksville from Knoxville with her husband Michael. Now locking up the restaurant that night was a different person's job. It was 24-year-old Marsha Klopp's responsibility. She was the assistant manager on duty. She was also married and had 3 children of her own, and as far as anyone knew, the only people left inside were her crew. Now at around 1:45 that morning, John Ballard, a Taco Bell shift manager who was off that night, came through the drive-thru to check on Marsha. She told him that they were running behind and probably would not be able to leave until 3:30 or 4 a.m. And so John left and the restaurant stayed open for drive-thru. Now a few hours later, at 7:25 that morning, he returned to open the restaurant and noticed that all of the employees' cars were still in the lot. He unlocked the front door and went inside, and when he reached the back of the restaurant, he saw a body lying on the floor near the rear of the building. And frightened by the sight, he ran back outside, locked the door behind him, and called 911. Now soon, Officer Tony Blakely of the Clarksville Police Department entered the Taco Bell on Riverside Drive to find all 4 members of the closing crew dead inside the restaurant. Kevin, Angela, Patricia, and Marsha had each been shot multiple times, with some of the shots fired at close range, including shots to the head. Several of them also had injuries to their hands and arms. Now in the back office, the safe had been forced open and the locking dial blown off with a shotgun blast. There was around $3,000 missing, and shortly after, TBA agent Jeff Puckett took charge of the scene and organized a team to search the surrounding area. And near the McDonald's beside the Taco Bell, they actually recovered shotgun shells, a black wallet, a glove, and several coin wrappers. And further out, on the bank of the Red River, they found a black hooded jacket and a pair of white surgical gloves. Now outside the investigation, the 4 families were trying to make sense of what had happened, and while they made arrangements to bury their loved ones, the detectives began speaking to the rest of the staff. One of the first people they heard from was Jelaine Walker, another employee who left the restaurant shortly after midnight on the night of the murders. She recounted that on her way out of the Taco Bell that night, she'd seen Courtney still inside the building, even though he'd already clocked out hours ago. Now this caught the investigators' interest, so they looked further into him and learned he was a soldier at Fort Camp and had only been working at the Taco Bell for 11 days. They also spoke with Dean Marie Keller, the assistant manager who actually hired him, and Cherie Underwood, the team unit manager. And Marie told detectives that when she hired Courtney, he asked about the restaurant's layout, what happened after hours, and how the closing routine worked. He also asked about a key to the opposite exit door, whether there were cameras inside, and what the roof and drop ceiling looked like. She also told the police that on the day before the murders, he asked whether the back door would trigger an alarm if it was open from the inside. And those interviews pretty much filled in the timeline of what Courtney had been doing in the days leading up to the murders. And then one witness, James Bowen, came forward and told investigators he overheard Courtney actually planning the entire robbery on January 21st, 1994 at the Oak Grove trailer park. Now while the detectives were gathering evidence, Courtney was breaking down because over the next few days, Shante and Carl noticed a change in him. He started keeping to himself and barely spoke, only staying in his room. And so on February 1st, Carl came home from work and found Courtney in a very bad way. He'd attempted to end his time on Earth and could barely speak. And as Carl tried to help him, Courtney told him that he did not deserve to go on. And in the same moment, he told Carl that he'd killed 4 people. Now 2 days after the murders, Courtney actually told Shante that whoever carried out the killings had gone into the Taco Bell before it closed, made their way to the men's restroom and climbed into the ceiling to wait. He said that 2 people were found in the kitchen and 2 in the storage area, and he described exactly how the safe had been opened and how the money had been taken. He told her details that weren't public yet. However, Shante did not go to the police. She only told investigators what she knew when they came to her. But on February 2nd, 1994, police brought Courtney in for questioning and searched his car. And in the back seat, investigators found a bowling bag, and hidden beneath a panel in the bottom was $2,576 in cash. And around the same time, the forensic results came back from the fingerprints lifted from the ceiling vent cover in the men's restroom, and they of course matched Courtney's. They were exactly where someone would have placed their hands to push aside a panel and pull themselves up into a ceiling. And the ballistics tied him to the shootings as well. A cartridge casing found in his room matched the 9mm casings recovered at the Taco Bell, and bullets from the scene matched fragments recovered from his bedroom floor. And so the same day, the police arrested Courtney and charged him with 4 counts of murder and robbery. He was held in a Montgomery County jail as the case moved toward trial. Now investigators actually also arrested another man, David Gene Hauser, after James Bowen told police that David had been part of the conversation about robbing the Taco Bell at the party, leading them to suspect that he helped Courtney carry it out. On December 12, 1997, the court sentenced him to 4 consecutive life sentences, plus 20 years for the robbery. But as horrifying as that was, the next case would take the same kind of horror even further, becoming one of the deadliest and most chilling cases. Henry Louis Wallace was born on November 4th, 1965 in Barnwell, South Carolina. He was raised by his mother, Lottie Mae Wallace, along with his older sister, Yvonne, in a small home with no plumbing or electricity. Now Lottie worked long hours and ran a pretty strict household, and when she felt that children needed punishment, she beat them with extension cords, garden hoses, and whatever else was nearby. And when she was too tired to do it herself, she made Henry and Yvonne whoop each other. Now despite this upbringing, Henry was pretty popular and well liked at Barnwell High School. He was elected to the student council, and when his mother refused to let him play football, he joined the cheerleading squad instead. Now after graduating from Barnwell High in May of 1983, Henry spent 1 semester at South Carolina State College, then another at Denmark Technical College, although he would eventually leave both schools without ever graduating. Now around the same time, he worked evenings as a disc jockey at a small local radio station in Barnwell. He liked the attention and the performance side of it, but he was fired after he was caught stealing CDs from the station. And with college behind him and the radio job gone, Henry decided to join the US Navy in December of 1984 and was shipped out to recruit training in Orlando, Florida. Now the Navy actually gave him purpose, and for several years he did well there. Henry rose to the rank of Petty Officer 3rd Class, which was a mid-level rank that came with responsibility over the sailors below. Now one supervisor described him as an outstanding seaman who willingly followed orders, completed his assigned tasks on time, and demonstrated a level of knowledge that exceeded what was expected at his rank. Now by 1987, Henry married his high school girlfriend, Moretta Brabham. Now Moretta actually already had a daughter, Tiandra, and Henry decided to adopt her. And for a time, Moretta and Tiandra followed him as he was transferred to the West Coast and back again. But the marriage was already under strain because Henry wanted a child with Moretta, while she didn't want to have any more children. Now in January of 1988, while stationed in Washington, he was actually arrested for breaking into a hardware store. And this is when things began to fall apart. It was also during this period that he began using drugs, including a white substance that you can put up your nose. Now in June, he pleaded guilty to second-degree burglary and received 38 days in jail and 24 months of supervised probation. He was assigned to probation officer Patrick Sieber, but according to Patrick, he failed to show up for most of his mandatory meetings, and by 1990, a warrant had been issued for his arrest. Now the same year, he returned to Barnwell to visit his family, and by this time, Henry was 24, and it was there that he ran into Tashanda Bethia again, a girl he'd known since childhood, who was now 18. Now their families had known each other for years, as their mothers worked at the same factory and were close friends, and at some point, Henry and Tashanda had even briefly dated, but she pulled away from him and he'd grown angry about it. Now one day in March of 1990, he offered her a ride in his car, car, and she naturally got in. Now, pretty soon an argument broke out in the car, and he decided to drive her toward a pond in western Barnwell County, which is where he suddenly attacked her, took her life, and then left her in the water. Now, when Tashana didn't come home for a while, her family reported her missing, and Barnwell police started asking questions. Now, Henry was one of the people they spoke to since he'd known her for years, and was already their prime suspect. Now, Henry was questioned, but denied any involvement, and was then released since there wasn't enough evidence to actually keep him there. But then on April 1st, 1990, two fishermen found her body in the pond, and the autopsy showed that she'd been choked to death. But the police still did not have enough evidence to charge Henry, so the case went cold. Now, in February of 1991, Henry decided to break into Barnwell High School and WDOG radio station, stealing video and recording equipment. He was eventually caught when he tried to pawn it, and would end up serving 4 months in state prison in Allendale. And within months of his release from prison, he was also discharged from the Navy, and his marriage to Moretta ended in divorce shortly after. He stayed briefly with his sister Yvonne in Rock Hill, but by late 1991, he decided to move to East Charlotte to start over again. Now, over the next several months, he cycled through fast food jobs near East End Mall, Taco Bell, Bojangles, Captain D's, and the Black Eyed Peas, losing some of them as his substance abuse began creeping in. Now, despite this, he eventually worked his way up to shift manager at a Taco Bell in Charlotte. Now, this job put him around young women every day. He supervised them and got to know them. And it was around this time that he also started dating Sadie McKnight, a young woman that also lived in East Charlotte. Now, Henry is 26 now, and at the same time, he's meeting other women in the area. In May of 1992, for example, Henry picked up Sharon Nance, a 32-year-old woman living in Charlotte. She had left her Aunt Linda's house that night in a black dress, talking about going out with friends. Now, she also had a son at home, and during the drive with Henry, she mentioned that Henry would have to pay her for any intimate activities they engaged in. Now, Henry didn't like this, and so the two got into an argument, and in the middle of the chaos, he then proceeded to beat her to death with a rock. He then drove to Russell's Ferry Road, dumped her body near the railroad tracks, and then drove off. And when Sharon didn't come home, nor called, Linda knew that something was wrong, and it wasn't until a week later, watching the news, that the family learned what had happened, as the police recovered Sharon's body on May 27th near Russell's Ferry Road. Now, the officers opened a homicide investigation again, secured the scene, and began retracing her last known movements, trying to find out who'd seen her. Now, the detective spoke to people who knew her, and worked the case as a single, separate killing. Now, during the investigation, Henry resumed his daily routine working as a manager at the Taco Bell restaurant, and during this period, he now started living with his girlfriend Sadie, and became close with Caroline Love, Sadie's roommate and co-worker at Bojangles. Now, on June 15, 1992, Caroline finished her shift, got some quarters so she could do laundry, and then left for the apartment. Now, after her cousin Robert Ross drove her home, Caroline went inside, and Henry was already there. He'd entered the apartment with a copy of his key while both women were out, and when Caroline came in, he called out from the bathroom and said he would leave in a moment. But when he decided to come out, he went into the living room where Caroline was, kissed her on the cheek, and made a move on her. Now, she told him that she wouldn't tell Sadie if he promised not to do it again, but instead of accepting that deal, he decided to attack her, put her in a chokehold, and drag her into the bedroom, which is where he did unspeakable things to her and then killed her. Now, once she was no longer breathing, Henry left briefly to move his car closer to the stairwell. He came back, wrapped Caroline's body in a bedsheet, and then placed it inside a large orange trash bag, and took her money from the dresser. He carried everything downstairs, loaded it into his car, and drove to Statesville Road, where he stopped and carried the bag into the woods. Now, the next day, he actually returned to the body, because he was worried that the orange bag could be seen from the road. So he removed her body from the bag and moved it into a nearby shallow ravine. Now, when Caroline didn't show up for work, the first call came from Bojangles. After she missed 2 shifts, her employer contacted her sister, Kathy Love, and Kathy went to the apartment and left a note. But when Caroline still didn't turn up the next day, the concern grew, and so Kathy reached out to Henry, who knew both women. Now, from there, Kathy, Sadie, and Henry went together to the police station to file a missing person report. Henry stood at the counter and answered the officer's questions about Caroline and told him that he had no idea where she might be. Kathy went back to the apartment with investigators, and they started looking around. Now, the furniture had been slightly moved, and the bedsheets from Caroline's bedroom were gone, proving someone had been there. And investigator Anthony Rice retraced her last known movements and spoke to her manager at Bojangles, who told them that the last time she saw her was the night she left work, and before she left, she traded a $10 bill for a roll of quarters. And so, with no witnesses or a confirmed crime scene, the case stayed open as a missing person investigation. And so Henry simply went back to his shifts, spending evenings at Granville Apartments with friends. Now, he was still around the same small circle of women, still slipping in and out of their daily lives. Now, a different woman he talked to on the regular was Shauna Denise Hawk. Shauna was 20 years old, studying to become a paralegal, and working part-time at a Taco Bell store, where Henry had once been her manager before moving on to other jobs. She lived with her mother, Sylvia Sumter, who went by the nickname Dee. Now on February 19, 1983, Henry went to Shauna's home while her mother was still out, and the two spent time talking. Then, as he was getting ready to leave, he told her that he wanted to be intimate with her, but Shauna already had a boyfriend, so she resisted. But then he attacked her, dragged her into the bathroom, and ended her life. And before leaving, he took her keys and $50 from the wardrobe. Now later that evening, Dee came home and started making dinner. Now Shauna's car was gone, but her coat and purse were still in the house. Now Shauna was also supposed to pick up her godson, 2-year-old Jermyn Williams, and she hadn't actually done that. So of course Dee called Shauna's boyfriend, Daryl Kirkpatrick, but he hadn't seen her either. So she decided to check Shauna's purse and noticed that her keys and some money were missing. Now Daryl came over and the two decided to call the police to report her missing. And after that call, Daryl walked through the house and went downstairs to the bathroom and noticed that the carpet was soaking. He pulled the shower curtain and found Shauna in the bathtub. And so he ran upstairs and told Dee to call 911. Now the emergency crew arrived and tried to revive her, but she was pronounced dead at the hospital. Meanwhile, over the next 18 months from then on, Henry went on a killing spree. First it was 24-year-old Audrey Spain, who'd come to Charlotte from South Carolina and ended up at Taco Bell working along Henry. Then 21-year-old Valencia Jumper, who was a political science major at Johnson Smith University and a close friend of his sister. After her it was 20-year-old Michelle Stinson, who was studying graphic arts and had 2 young sons. 25-year-old Vanessa Mack, who knew him through his sister, who worked with him at Taco Bell, who also had a 4-month-old daughter. 24-year-old Betty Baucom, who was Sadie's co-worker at Bojangles, and 18-year-old Brandy Henderson, who was the girlfriend of one of Henry's closest friends. And each time he killed one of these women, he walked free and avoided suspicion. Now fast forward to March 10, 1994, and Sergeant Gary McFadden called his detectives together to compare the recent strangulation cases. Vanessa, Brandy, and Betty were all killed in their own apartments, and none of them showed any signs of forced entry. And so the investigators went back to the families and friends of each woman and asked who they would have trusted enough to let inside. And when those conversations came back, detectives were left with one common name: Henry Wallace. And so they now had a person. The only thing they needed was proof. Now Betty's abandoned car and Vanessa's bank card gave them 2 leads they could actually work with. Now Betty's car had been wiped clean, except for the fact that the person forgot to wipe the trunk, and so they were able to lift a palm print from the car, and it actually matched Henry's. As for Vanessa's card, surveillance footage from the ATM where someone had tried to use it after her death showed a man wearing a distinctive cross earring that matched the one Henry was known to wear. And so for the first time, investigators had physical evidence tying one man to multiple victims, and so they put out the word to find him, but Henry was still out there. Now on March 12th, Lovey Slaughter went to her daughter's apartment, expecting to let herself in with her key, but when she put it in the lock, she realized that the door was already open. She walked in and found Deborah, her daughter, on the floor and called 911. Now Officer Ronnie Chambers responded and found Deborah face up on the floor. Her purse had been dumped out and she had a sock in her mouth, towels around her neck, and multiple puncture wounds in her chest. And the autopsy confirmed that she'd been strangled and stabbed 38 times with wounds that had pierced her heart and lung. But that same evening she died between 5 and 5:30 p.m. Officers actually found Henry hiding in the bathroom of a friend's apartment on the east side of Charlotte. But he was actually arrested on an outstanding warrant for shoplifting a $48 sweater from East End Mall. At least this was the official reasoning. Now officers took him to the law enforcement center rather than the usual intake facility on orders from their supervisor. And shortly before 7 p.m. the investigators were in the interview room with Henry to press him on the murders. Now in the early hours of March 13th, investigator Anthony Rice entered the room, and Henry already knew him from the Caroline case. But he did something unorthodox. Moments later, Anthony actually asked everyone to bow their heads. He took Henry's hand and led a prayer about thanks and repentance. And when it was over, he told Henry that it was time to cleanse his soul and actually tell the truth. And Henry actually broke down crying. He picked up a pen and wrote out the names of the women he'd killed. And by the time the interview was over, Henry had confessed to 9 murders in Charlotte. He also admitted to the earlier killings of Sharon Nance in Charlotte and Tashonda in South Carolina. And so just over 3 weeks after Henry confessed, on April 4th, 1994, a grand jury indicted him on 9 counts of first-degree murder, along with multiple intimate crime counts and robbery with a deadly weapon. He was held without bond. He was then sentenced to 9 death sentences, 1 for each murder. But as of 2026, he's not been executed. He still remains on death row. Next, we'll talk about the most unsettling crimes at McDonald's. On the first day of 2010, Melody DeShane stopped at a drive-thru of a McDonald's branch in Toledo, Ohio at 10:30 a.m. to order a bucket of the restaurant's famous chicken McNuggets. Now, if you aren't familiar with American fast food menus, meals like McNuggets aren't usual breakfast options. And while some restaurants might have them ready in the morning, they're usually staple lunch and dinner chicken strips. So when Melody came asking for McNuggets that early, it wasn't certain that she was going to have them. And when the person working at McDonald's told her that they didn't have any McNuggets ready, she absolutely lost it. After this point, the drive-thru worker tried to close the window, but Melody would simply put her hand through and try to hit the employee, and then said, The branch manager then tried to help, but Melody just kept trying to come through the drive-thru window, so she shut the door completely, but not before the two got very physical with themselves. Melody hit the manager several times, while the manager in retaliation grabbed Melody's hair. The employees were completely stunned, and Melody on the other side just kept banging at the window, screaming McNuggets, and at one point made another Dragon Ball Z reference. "You want a piece of me? I will go Super Saiyan," she said. She would then stop the banging, but instead reach for a bottle in her car and shatter the drive-thru glass before zooming off the scene screaming. The police actually eventually arrested Melody, and according to their reports, she was drunk during the entire incident. Melody was sentenced to 60 days in jail for vandalism and was ordered to pay around $1,500 for the damages to the drive-thru section. This, however, isn't the only time we'll see food crash outs on the list. This next case is very similar to Melody's chicken nugget case, just this time it was Egg McMuffins. Back in 2013, an Ohio man and his friends pulled up to a McDonald's around 3:30 a.m. and tried to order an Egg McMuffin sandwich. It was pretty early, and the chances of McMuffins being available were low, but the men still insisted that this was what they wanted. When the employee told them that they couldn't get any McMuffins that early in the morning, things got heated between the men and the employee on duty, and they eventually began to exchange words. The man called the employee a slur, and when she spoke back, instead of keeping the dispute verbal, or maybe just choosing to walk away, he decided to pull out a gun and proceeded to curse at her and drove off the scene. Now the employee was absolutely terrified. Her entire life had just flashed before her eyes, all because of an Egg McMuffin order. But despite that, she managed to put herself together and called the police. But by the time they arrived, the men were long gone, which makes it even scarier when they think that the culprit is probably still somewhere right now, terrorizing more innocent people. Now maybe this person was never caught, but believe me when I tell you the next case is a literal magic show. The miracle car case is one of the most magical cases that have gone down in a McDonald's. Because back in 2013, Virginia Maiden, a McDonald's employee in Kennewick, Washington, started her regular Tuesday with the shock of her life. That morning, Virginia woke up to not find her 1995 Toyota 4Runner sitting in her apartment complex's parking lot as usual. Apparently, she'd forgotten to lock the vehicle the night before, and since it was no longer there, it was pretty obvious that someone had stolen it. Virginia spent hours looking for it, but all her efforts weren't paying off, so she reported the case to the police and headed to work to continue the rest of her day. That day, Virginia was put on drive-thru duty, and not long into her day, she noticed a car that really resembled her missing car. Initially, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her, but as Virginia paid closer attention, she began to realize that the car she was looking at was actually hers. It had her license plate and her McDonald's visor that was still in the dashboard. By the time the car arrived at the drive-thru, there was no doubt in Virginia's mind that the vehicle she was looking at was hers. The woman inside it was 22-year-old Catherine York, and she came to order an ice cream and a couple of other meal combos. Now, Virginia actually told Catherine that the ice cream machine was faulty and that she should pull over at the other window while she fixed it. Catherine didn't think much of it, so she complied. And so while she waited, Virginia decided to call the police on her. And when they arrived, they arrested Catherine and also found clothes that she had stolen from a JCPenney and Sears store. And according to Virginia's manager, "You would think whoever stole the car would say, I'm not going to go to a McDonald's because the owner works there." Now, the miracle car case was the end of the lighthearted cases, because from here on out, it is complete horror. As in the next and very similar case, Shanika Torres wasn't so lucky to escape her crash out. In February 2014, a Michigan woman named Shanika Torres drove to a McDonald's branch in the Grand Rapids area and placed an order for a bacon cheeseburger. But this single order resulted in a tragic incident that ruined her life forever. When Shanika's burger arrived, it was without any bacon, and this made her so furious that she immediately started a small scene in the restaurant. Now, upon hearing the noise outside, the manager of the restaurant came out to see what was going on, and eventually she managed to calm Shanika down. As compensation for her troubles, he offered to give Shanika a free meal, so she told her to come back in a couple of hours. So Shanika left the restaurant and waited until the time was up, and then she came back with a friend to get her burger. This time she decided to use the drive-thru. As her vehicle stopped at the window, Shanika explained to the waiter there that her order was messed up and that she was here to get compensated. The waiter went in, prepared the burger, and handed it to Shanika, but for some reason they messed up her order again, forgetting to add bacon.
Driver handed me the bag, so I took the bag back and proceeded to walk away to let Table know that her order was wrong again.
Now Shanika was beyond furious. She'd used her voice the first time and they apparently didn't listen to her, so she decided to use something louder and much more dangerous.
Next thing you know, I just hear something pop.
Shanika reached for her purse and pulled out a 9mm Glock and shot at the drive-thru window.
Well, she did indeed fire that 9mm handgun after workers during 2 different stops at the same restaurant.
Thankfully, no one was injured, but she and her friend then immediately drove off. But unfortunately, they couldn't get very far, because only 30 minutes later, the police located them at Shanika's home, and so she was immediately placed under arrest and hit with several serious charges. Now, a couple of weeks later, Shanika was in court, fighting to stay out of prison. In her defense, Shanika's attorney argued that his client had no intention to harm and had mistakenly fired the gun, but no one was actually buying any of that. And so after a brief trial, Shanika was found guilty of carrying and discharging a concealed weapon, and on April 21st was given a 7-year sentence to match. Shanika's crash out may have been unwarranted, but this next case, however, is even more disturbing since the victim was a small human. The first time Jakeem Jackson got arrested was in 2022. Jakeem was working as a contractor for a paratransit service in Broward County, Florida, when a paraplegic man in a wheelchair accused him of touching certain parts of him without consent. Now, for privacy reasons, the details of his first case were never revealed to the public, but what we do know is that Jakeem would eventually plead no contest to lewd and inappropriate touching, but he wouldn't actually face any jail time. Instead, the court sentenced him to probation. But before his probation was actually over, Jakeem would commit a more serious offense that implicated both him and the business he worked for. It's June 4th, 2023. Jakeem is at the McDonald's located on Federal Highway. He was a shift manager at the restaurant, which meant that he had some level of authority over the other staff. But instead of focusing on his job and staying out of trouble, Jakeem decided to do the exact opposite. Earlier that morning, the Hallandale Beach Police Department had received a call from one of Jakeem's female co-workers, who was a younger person, and for the sake of the story, we'll call her Alice. According to Alice's version of events, Jakeem had suddenly walked up to her to give her an unwanted hug, and continued to hold on to her while she tried to pull away from him. He then continued to approach her afterwards, and at one point would even touch certain parts over her clothing. A video of this incident recorded by Alice was shared with the Hallandale Beach Police, where Jackson could be seen repeatedly advancing towards her despite her shouting for him to leave her alone. However, this video was never released to the public. After identifying Jakeem, the officers then placed him under arrest, and then transported him back to the Broward main jail. And it wouldn't take long for news of his arrest to begin to spread around the area. And in response, the owner/operator of the McDonald's location released a statement saying, "We're appalled by the unacceptable behavior of this former employee. Nothing is more important than the safety and well-being of our people, and my organization has no tolerance for harassment. Immediately after we learned about this incident, we terminated the employee and contacted the Hallandale Police Department. We've offered our full support to the victim and are cooperating with the police investigation." The franchise also claimed to have conducted a background check, but that was before Jakeem found himself on the offender registry, so his records actually came back clean. As of now, his case has gone completely silent, so it's not known whether he's been sentenced or his trial is still pending. But in this next case, we see what happens when innocent children have to grow up with very irresponsible and disgusting people. Back in 2016, just around 9:30 p.m., the Orange Police Department received a distressing call from a McDonald's branch in the Boston Post Road area, and by the time they arrived, they had to record an unusual and very unsettling crime. Some McDonald's employees had reported 28-year-old Kimberly Honorado and 27-year-old Rory Clark because the couple decided to pick the restaurant parking spot as the most comfortable place to do adult stuff. After picking up a meal from the food chain, they went into their car and decided that for some reason, this was the best place to get intimate, in the front seat. By the time the police arrived, Kimberly barely had any clothes on. Now, all of this is already pretty freaky, but what transformed this crime from probably just lack of control to pure and profound evil was what the police found at the backseat of the vehicle. An awake, alert, and innocent small human at the back of the vehicle. He was forced to watch the scaring horror Kimberly and Rory had going on. Now, according to the couple, they were just cuddling, but the witnesses confirmed otherwise. And so the two were charged with breach of space and damaging the morals of a younger individual, while the small human in the back was placed in the safe custody of a relative. But if you think this case is mind-blowing, this next person built a drug empire from a small fast food block. Back in 2014, 26-year-old Shantia Dennis transformed her simple drive-thru role into one of the most artistic drug dealing rings ever. Now, Shantia Dennis worked as the employee in charge of the drive-thru window at a McDonald's in Pittsburgh, but her salary as a McDonald's employee wasn't making ends meet, so she decided to sell one of the most dangerous hard substances with probably the most innocent packages in the franchise. Shantia began using the Happy Meal packs that were meant for kids to sell a particular hard substance that we're going to keep unnamed and just call it H for the sake of the video. Now, all Shantia's customer had to do was stop by the restaurant drive-thru and say the words, "I'd like to order a toy," and Shantia would then give whoever it was a classic Happy Meal pack, complete with a SpongeBob SquarePants figurine and an amount of H. While the normal Happy Meals cost $2 back then, Shantia charged 40 times extra for her substance edition. Now, with the help of a tip, the Pittsburgh District Attorney in Narcotics Enforcement went on an undercover mission and set up a fake buy. And as usual, Shantia heard the usual secret code, took the money and put it in her shirt. But not long after, she was arrested by the police. Now, she tried to deny all the claims, but the undercover officers had taken note of the serial numbers on the money they'd given to her, and it matched.
You selling in those Happy Meals?
No, I wasn't.
Dennis is the second McDonald's worker in 2 weeks to be arrested for allegedly selling on the job.
During the arrest, the police also found a different $80 on Shantia, which meant that she made a sale before they actually approached her. They also found an extra brick of H on her, which would have amounted to about 40 to 50 bags when broken down. And that wasn't the only case of substance sales in a McDonald's branch the same month in 2014. Just 2 weeks before Shantia's arrest, Theodore Upshaw was also conducting a similar H operation from the parking lot of a McDonald's. And just like Shantia, he was also exposed after an anonymous tip led to an undercover drug enforcement purchase.
Police caught Theodore Upshaw at the McDonald's in Murraysville.
Theodore might have been looking at a more severe sentence, as there was a series of overdose cases as a result of his laced H, but the authorities claimed that he wasn't responsible for it. Another McDonald's employee was arrested this month for selling H out of a restaurant in nearby Murraysville. Authorities said the H, recovered Wednesday, does not appear to be related to the laced H blamed for 22 overdose deaths in southwestern Pennsylvania. The entire H McDonald's case is insane, but this next case is so controversial, it lasted for half a decade. Back in 2005, Albert Garcia Jr. was a regular 18-year-old high school senior who lived in the Bronx with his family. Albert played high school football and also worked part-time at McDonald's. Most people liked him, and his neighbors described Albert as a good kid. But there was one thing about Albert that stood out, and that was his hatred for the police. And this hatred would drive Albert to commit one of the most sickening crimes you could think of. On January 29, 2005, a police officer named John Florio ordered a number 1. That's a Big Mac, French fries, and soda from a McDonald's in Queens. John picked up his order and walked his service dog down to Randall's Island to have his meal. But just as John took a bite off his burger, blood almost immediately poured out from his mouth. And when John looked at his burger, he saw broken glass pieces in it and immediately rushed to the Long Island Jewish Hospital for treatment. John suffered severe cuts to his mouth, including a broken tooth, and eventually word ran around in the police department that Albert Garcia, who worked in the restaurant, was responsible for this, so they decided to make him pay. The police decided to start an undercover investigation. They sent another cop to get a burger from the same branch John got spiked at. And according to him, when Albert noticed he was a cop, he spat in the burger that served him. He was of course then arrested and charged with assault, reckless endangerment, and criminal possession of a weapon. As reports claim that he actually admitted to smashing a picture frame and then grinding the shards of glass and putting them into the hamburger. Albert said, "I put the little pieces of glass into the burger as a joke. I didn't know it was going to be sold to a cop." But that was just the first part of this case, because despite admitting to the crime on record, Albert actually refused to plead guilty and continued to contest the case even though everything seemed out of his reach. Florio, on the other hand, sued the company for $6 million for all the injuries he sustained as a result of eating the burger, but later actually settled for only $15,000. But 5 years later, the actual truth came to light. According to Albert's lawyer, the whole case was just a front for John Florio to get a large chunk of money from McDonald's from court settlements, and that there was no way to actually verify his story. And even after an x-ray on his throat, doctors couldn't find any evidence of cuts in his throat. After Albert's arrest in 2005, he was taken to the interrogation room and put under so much pressure that he had to admit to the accusations, even though he wasn't actually guilty. Albert described the interrogation techniques as though he was a dog, and even claimed that he admitted to putting the picture frame glass in the burger just so they would let him go. However, after forensic analysis, it was revealed that the glass in the burger wasn't actually the same as of any picture frame in the McDonald's. It was also revealed that a strand of hair found in the burger as evidence didn't actually match Albert's, and so Albert was declared not guilty, and in March of 2010 he was acquitted and awarded $437,000 in damage. And so the police officer did all of this just to try to get $15,000 from McDonald's. The entire story was insane, and according to Albert, he was just glad to be able to move on from the whole situation and live his normal life. He said, "Now that this is over, now I can live my life." Albert Garcia might have been lucky, but we really can't say the same thing in our next case. Now, we've seen a lot of insane violent crimes on the list. This next one is probably the most unnecessary and dumbest jail case that you would ever come across, because back in 2012, Mark Bear went to jail simply because of $1 worth of soda. Mark Bear was from Naples, Florida, and to be honest, he wasn't the most law-abiding citizen in the area. He had run-ins with the law on several occasions and would consistently dodge serious punishments because most of his crimes were petty. But little did Mark know that when all of those petty crimes span his names and the records are summed, they form into much more serious penalties for him. So in April of 2012, Mark went to a McDonald's branch in Collier County of Florida and asked for a cup of water. But when the cup was given to Mark, he decided to actually fill his water cup with soda. Mark then took his illegal soda in front of the restaurant. But then the manager of the McDonald's, who was aware of what he'd done, came to Mark and gave him two options. It was either pay for the soda he stole, which would cost $1, or he would have to leave the premises right now. But Mark had a bonus option for the manager, and that was to be a total nuisance. He refused to leave and began cursing at the manager. And so the manager, of course, decided to call the cops. And this is where it gets interesting. By the time the police arrived, they realized they weren't dealing with a new offender. Mark was a repeat offender and was known as Red or Clown by the police department. And so they immediately arrested him. And by the time he got to court, he couldn't believe the judge's ruling. Mark was arrested and charged for petty theft because he stole soda worth $1. And according to the law, that's a misdemeanor. However, that wasn't Mark's first or second or third petty theft. So a simple misdemeanor turned into a felony. And in Florida, a third-degree felony, which was what Mark did, can result in a sentence of up to 5 years and a $5,000 fine, which meant that Mark wasn't going to get off easy. Now, fortunately for him, Mark was eventually released on a $6,500 bond and didn't actually face any jail time. But only a month later, he was reported to have been arrested again for trespassing at a Pizza Hut. And in this next case, we once again have an unsatisfied and ignorant customer. On New Year's Eve of 2019, in St. Petersburg, Florida, 40-year-old Daniel Taylor was a little bit hungry, so he decided to walk into a Clearwater McDonald's branch around 7 p.m. Inside the restaurant, he met Jasmine James over the counter. Daniel made his order and waited a little bit, and everything seemed to be sailing smoothly, but not until his order actually came. Now, we don't know what exactly Daniel Taylor had paid for, but it included a drink or some liquid, and he expected it to come with a straw, as usual. But a month before, St. Petersburg City Council had actually banned single-use straws, which meant that restaurants could no longer display them and only gave it to customers that make direct requests. But Daniel wasn't actually aware of this new law and was pretty annoyed that he didn't see any straws around, so he got into an argument with Jasmine, blaming her for the lack of straws. Things got heated quickly, and Daniel then grabbed Jasmine by the collar. Now, Jasmine wasn't having any of this. She was almost half of Daniel's size, but had also been taking boxing classes, so she immediately began to punch Daniel in the face and head. Now Jasmine's co-workers managed to save Daniel from her, and the branch's manager tried to settle things down. But according to an eyewitness, Daniel then went over to counter to fight the manager and then assaulted another employee who apparently was in recovery from a C-section operation. Daniel then actually managed to escape just before the cops arrived, but moments later they received a report of an unarmed robbery in a liquor store just 2 miles from the McDonald's branch, and when they arrived it was again Daniel Taylor, and they immediately of course took him to custody. Now it was revealed that he was actually homeless and had been intoxicated all the way through the night, and so Daniel was arrested on 2 charges of battery and was sentenced to 60 days in prison. But since he'd already served 58 days, the judge ordered Daniel to pay $1,000 on fines or perform nearly 120 hours of community service. Jasmine on the other hand was given paid leave, but instead of returning, she actually sued McDonald's, claiming that she had to call 911 by herself when the incident had occurred and that the employees weren't actually trained for situations like this. But unfortunately, there's no public information whether Jasmine received any money from McDonald's or not. Now Daniel Taylor's arrest might have been disturbing. What comes next, however, is even more unsettling, since the crime could have been prevented if the police actually just did their job. On December 27, 2023, a 30-year-old man named Percy Woody carried out one of the most disturbing killing sprees in Charleston, West Virginia, and it all started from the small McDonald's branch where he made a living. Percy Rashawn Woody wasn't a stranger to a life of crime. On numerous occasions, he'd faced problems with law enforcement agents and was frequently in and out from jail for one crime or the other. His first recorded arrest was in January 2018, when officers were called to the scene of a violent incident on the 1300 block of Renaissance Circle in Charleston. Percy was said to have gotten into a verbal argument with a man named Anton Clanton, and while there's no information about what triggered the fight, Percy would escalate the situation by pulling out a weapon and stabbing Anton 5 times. Once police arrived, Percy was taken into custody and would later be charged with felony malicious wounding, and he would later enter a guilty plea in September of 2018 and was sentenced to 1 year of probation. But being on probation didn't stop Percy from committing even more crimes, because on August 17, 2019, Percy would again be arrested for slashing another victim's face with a box cutter. His probation of course was immediately revoked, and he would end up staying in jail until September of 2020, when he would plead guilty to violating his probation and malicious wounding again. This time Percy was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in prison with credits for time served. Now by 2022, Percy was released from prison, but it wouldn't take long before he would get in trouble once again. On April 25th, police were called to a discount clothing store in Mercer County after Percy started harassing customers and refused to leave. But even after the officers arrived, Percy still wouldn't cooperate. Instead, he got extremely violent, repeatedly trying to stab an officer in the leg with a box cutter and even attempting to grab another officer's gun. He would later be apprehended and charged with attempting to disarm a police officer, battery on a law enforcement officer, and obstruction. And about a month later, he then pleaded guilty to attempting to commit a felony and battery on a police officer. He would eventually be sentenced once again to 1 to 3 years in prison for the attempted felony and 1 year for the battery. The sentences were ordered to be served concurrently, and he received credit for the 224 days he'd already spent in jail. But on October 31st, 2023, Percy would again be released from prison. Still violent, still not rehabilitated. Now in an attempt to integrate back into society, Percy would get a job at a McDonald's branch on McCorkle Avenue. However, Woody's employer didn't know about his violent nature because he wasn't from around that area. Now Percy had this very weird habit of having sharp objects on him, and the next time he would use one of them, the bloodshed that followed was staggering. On that fateful day in December 2023, Woody was in charge of the drive-thru, and during his shift he got into an argument with one of his co-workers, and things got so heated that he put the co-worker in a chokehold. Another co-worker, Kristen Miller, then tried to de-escalate the situation, but on that day Woody also had his box cutter on him, and so he pulled that out and slashed her in the neck. He then stabbed the other co-worker that he had in a chokehold in the face, and this is what Kristen Miller had to say about this.
I could feel something dripping down my neck, and I go and I grab and realize that he got me. He's practically slit my throat. At first, it was such a fast-paced thing that happened. I didn't even realize what had happened.
Woody then tried to escape, and on his way he cut a customer who just walked into the restaurant with his box cutter. He then took the streets and went towards Roosevelt Avenue. It was a residential area, and a woman was taking out her trash in front of her home. And when Woody saw her, he decided to attack her with his weapon too, still dressed in his McDonald's uniform. He beat her up and cut her and then continued his escape.
The terrifying wake-up call for neighbors like Jeff and Jennifer Wright, who received an unexpected knock on their door.
You know, you're half asleep, you're just waking up, and you don't expect to find your neighbor at your door covered in blood.
By this time, the police had already been alerted, and a chase was already on. And when Woody realized that the cops were closing in on him, he did something very unexpected, which just further proves how unstable he was. He turned the box cutter on himself and tried to check himself out of this world. However, the officers were quick to stop him before it was too late, and he was then hospitalized. Luckily, none of his victims suffered life-threatening wounds and were all rushed to the hospital for treatment. Woody would end up facing 4 counts of malicious wounding and 1 count of obstruction. Numerous lawsuits were also filed against McDonald's, forcing the company to release a statement saying, "We are shocked and saddened by the violent attack that took place at our restaurant this morning. Nothing is more important than the safety of our employees and customers. Right now we're focused on supporting our people with time off and counseling services and assisting law enforcement. Despite everything, Percy Woody would never face trial, because on October 2nd, 2024, he was found unresponsive in his jail cell, in the South Central Regional Jail, at the age of 38. His cause of death remains unknown. Percy almost turned into a sick, cold killer. But this next case is even more unsettling, since it involves a McDonald's employee who tried to escape from the law. In the spring of 2022, a 16-year-old guy named Jonathan Cox was at a house party in Surrey, alongside his friends and other teenagers from the neighboring towns. But in the middle of the party, some of the teenagers got into a verbal disagreement with each other, and soon they were throwing hands. Jonathan and his friends who had come to the party from the town of Camberley were at the center of this fight, and they would end up getting a beatdown by their rivals from the town of Aldershot. Most of them walked away with minor injuries that day, but while they moved on once the fight was over, Jonathan held onto the anger and embarrassment, specifically towards another teenager named Kyle Wright. And for the next few weeks, Jonathan's anger just kept building up, as he slowly waited for the day when he would get his revenge. But that day was closer than he thought it would be, because just weeks after the fight, Jonathan was informed about another house party, this time in his hometown. He knew that the other teens from Aldershot couldn't say no to a party, and after asking around for a bit, he finally got confirmation that Kyle and his friends were going to be there. And for Jonathan, this was the opportunity he'd been waiting for to get his lick back, and he wasn't going to let it slide. And so on May 27th, 2022, Kyle dressed up and got ready for the party. He was really invited, but planned to attend anyway. He then packed his backpack and got out of the house and hopped on his bike. Now back at the party, Kyle was busy having fun, unaware that Jonathan was on his way to ruin the night. CCTV footage from a home close to where the party was being held caught Kyle and his friends stepping out of the venue on Green Hill Road, close to the junction with Cobbed Hall Drive, at around 10 PM, laughing and talking among themselves. They stay outside for about 50 minutes before heading back in. Now Jonathan was already in the neighborhood at this point. Another CCTV camera in the area showed him getting down from his bike and securing it to a lamppost before continuing the rest of his journey on foot. Shortly afterwards, doorbell camera footage from the house from earlier showed Jonathan lurking outside the party venue. And then came Kyle and his friends. Once Jonathan noticed they were outside, he walked straight towards them, and you could see them getting into a verbal altercation right away. But suddenly, Jonathan reached into his bag and pulled out a machete, and before anyone could stop him, he stabbed Kyle in the chest. Severely injured and now bleeding badly, Kyle then tried to run from the scene, moving away from the view of the CCTV, but unfortunately he wouldn't go too far before falling to the ground and passing out. Once he realized that his mission was accomplished, Jonathan then ran away from the scene, while Kyle's friend tried to get him help. They called for emergency services in an attempt to save Kyle's life before it was too late, but despite the best efforts of the paramedics, Kyle was pronounced dead at the scene. Now around the same time, a police officer responding to the incident would notice Jonathan riding his bike erratically away from the scene of the crime, and without even knowing that he was the perpetrator, something just felt suspicious about him, which led the officer to turn his patrol car around in an attempt to chase him. But Jonathan already saw the officer coming and quickly vanished before he could be caught. He went straight home and got to work destroying every piece of evidence linking him to the incident. In footage captured by the CCTV in his neighborhood, Jonathan could be seen exiting his house while carrying a bag, and by the time he returned, the bag was gone. The next day, Jonathan was also seen carrying a bunch of items from his home and heading in the same direction he went the previous night. This would go on for a few more times, with Jonathan moving out of the house with a bag or some items and then returning empty-handed. He would also get rid of the bicycle altogether, since it could easily lead the officers to him. Now by this point, news of Kyle's death had spread across the area, and Jonathan knew that the police were searching for whoever was responsible for his killing. But Jonathan was confident that they wouldn't find him, and for a while he was actually right, because by the time the police brought in their first suspect, it wasn't actually Jonathan. Instead, they went ahead to arrest an innocent individual who supposedly fit the profile of the suspect they were searching for. But just because the police made a mistake at first didn't mean that Jonathan was going to get away with this horrific crime. As soon as the investigators started to examine the CCTV footage, something odd began to stand out about the suspect. He was significantly shorter than Kyle and his friends, which was weird because the suspect they had in custody was either the same height or taller than the victim. And this was when they realized that they had gotten the wrong guy. And after releasing the innocent person, the investigators went back to work on finding out who the real person in the footage was. And so they decided to finally speak with one of Kyle's friends, who gave them a description of the person he saw that night. But still, that would narrow down their search, as the friend didn't know who exactly Jonathan was. But they stated they got a tip from an unidentified source, identifying Jonathan as the perpetrator of the attack. And to determine whether this tip was credible or not, the officers looked into Jonathan's criminal history, only to find out that he'd actually had a prior issue with the law concerning a knife-related charge. Now, the details of this incident were made public, but for the police, finding this information was a breakthrough for the case. And so within a matter of hours, officers set out to locate Jonathan and bring him in for questioning. And they would find him, of course, working at a McDonald's in Camberley. Now, when the officers approached him, Jonathan completely freaked out, and upon hearing the charges he was being arrested for, Jonathan denied it, saying that he didn't have anything to do with Kyle's death. And Jonathan's behavior would become so erratic that the arresting officer would repeatedly ask him to calm down. But in his attempt to convince the officers that he wasn't the guy they were looking for, Jonathan would mention that he thought the officers already had a suspect in custody, which was strange since the officers never mentioned the name of the suspect he was being accused of killing. Now, once he was placed under arrest, the officers then headed to his home, and inside they found several knives and machetes, but none of them actually matched the weapon used in killing Kyle. As a matter of fact, the officers couldn't actually locate any actual physical evidence tying Jonathan to the incident. It almost looked like Jonathan was going to get away with it, until they actually checked his phone. And this is when they found a text message he exchanged with an unnamed friend days after the incident, where he talked about how he was scared of going to prison.
Yes, I didn't even mean to do this, I can't lie. I'm so paranoid, I need to burn everything and get rid of my bike for real. Everything is stashed in the forest. I bleached it, but not the handle. And my bike is locked up on another road. I'm so paranoid, man. I don't want to go to prison.
Suddenly, all the strange trips Jonathan was taking in the days after the incident started to make sense. Turns out he was actually moving all the evidence into a nearby woodland, where he then either burned them or got rid of them some other way. Unfortunately, neither the knife nor the bloodstained clothes Jonathan wore that day were ever found. But using the text and the CCTV footage, the officers believed that they had a very strong case against Jonathan. But for some reason, he actually still believed he could escape from the consequences, because upon arrival at the police station, Jonathan would write a statement, which would then be read by his lawyer. Jonathan made it clear that he wasn't going to answer any questions from the officers, but that didn't actually stop them from trying to get a confession out of him. But with every question, Jonathan simply replied with
no comments.
However, he couldn't keep that up for too long, because when the investigators brought out a picture of the machetes seized from his home, Jonathan spoke up. The officers then asked him why he collects those kinds of weapons and what he intends to do with them, but Jonathan still wasn't ready to cooperate. Instead, he told the officers that the machete was actually a toy. Jonathan would then present his alibi, telling the officers that he was out selling illicit substances on the day of the crime, so there's no way he could have been responsible for Carl's death. But that defense would fall flat when the case reached the courtroom. Because of the CCTV footage, the text, and other evidence collected during the investigation, Jonathan's trial only lasted 14 days. And on December 12, 2022, the jury at Guilford Crown Court returned an unanimous verdict, declaring Jonathan guilty of first-degree murder. His sentencing was scheduled for December 15th, and on that day, the senior investigating officer, Detective Chief Inspector Simon Dunn, from the Surrey and Sussex Major Crime Team, would read out a statement, revealing how he and his officers managed to solve the case without any physical evidence.
First and foremost, I would like to extend my heartfelt condolences to the family and friends of Kyle Wright. No one should ever have to endure the loss they've suffered. As soon as the murder investigation was launched, the team worked tirelessly to find the person responsible for Kyle's death. This included going through hours of CCTV footage, obtaining witness accounts in difficult circumstances, and plowing through mobile phone analysis to find the evidence. The painstaking work was pivotal in securing a conviction. Cox's motive for targeting Kyle appears to have come from a minor feud between separate groups of young people from neighboring towns. Cox went to the scene armed with a knife that night, with the intention of causing him serious harm. Unfortunately, this has resulted in the tragic and senseless death of a teenage boy with his whole life ahead of him.
Jonathan would then be sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. For Jonathan, this was the beginning of his punishment, but Kyle's parents now had to live with the pain of their son's death forever. And in the words of Kyle's mother,
he was a beloved, sweet, gentle son who wouldn't even hurt a fly. Every second without him is pure torture. Our hearts have been shattered into a million pieces. He was such a talented and dedicated basketball player and keen gym enthusiast. A parent should not have to bury her child. No child deserves this. Myself, your dad, your brother, family, friends, and the community are devastated.
What comes next, however, is the perfect example of what happens when an argument goes too far. Getting a customer's order wrong at a McDonald's isn't an uncommon occurrence, but sometimes a mistake as simple as this can lead to a major tragic event, and nobody understands this better than the employee at the McDonald's located in Atlanta. It was around 2:45 p.m. on December 28, 2023, when the police received a chilling call from the business location concerning a violent confrontation between an employee and a customer. But by the time the officers arrived on the scene, things had already gotten out of control. Inside the restaurant, they found an employee named Tamanika Woods lying in a pool of her own blood. She was immediately taken to the Grady Memorial Hospital for emergency treatment. But while the doctors attempted to save her life, her condition had become too critical, and she was declared dead not long after arriving at the hospital. Confused as to who could have been responsible for the attack on Tamanika, the officers began speaking to the witnesses present at the scene, who informed them that Tamanika had actually gotten into a verbal altercation with a group of customers, later identified as sisters Tania, Marlo, and Abel Evans. But in the middle of the scuffle that followed, Tania would pull out a gun and fire at Tamanika, ending her life instantly. But there were still so many holes in the story, so the officers decided to check the CCTV footage to understand how the whole thing started. Once the officers watched how the incident unfolded on the CCTV, they placed the three sisters under arrest and transported them back to the police station. And back at the station, investigators began working on establishing a timeline of events and reconstructing what really happened inside the McDonald's. So in order to get a full perspective on the incident, they separated the three into different interview rooms. And so the questioning began. The first sister to be interrogated was Mallow. To begin with, the officers collected all her information, including her age and address. And once that was done, they asked her to recount the events that led to the shooting. And that was when the story began to make sense. Mallow then explained that after they placed their order, the employees informed them that they were short-staffed, so they had to process the order together instead of handling them separately. However, after receiving their orders at the drive-thru, Mallow and her sisters discovered that it wasn't complete. And that was when things started to go south. To sort out the issue, the sisters decided to speak to one of the staff at the window, and upon learning about the error, the staff then apologized and promised to rectify it immediately. At this point, Mallow and her sisters left the drive-thru and headed into the restaurant so they could properly monitor their order. But according to Mallow, as soon as they entered, they could hear one of their employees in the back talking about them in a disrespectful manner. And within a matter of minutes, what started as a simple misunderstanding over an incomplete order had escalated into a verbal argument. Mallow, in her own version of events, claimed that Tamanika had kept trying to antagonize them and get under their skin so they could react. And although it's hard to verify if Tamanika actually threatened to shoot them first or not, since she unfortunately isn't around to tell her own side of the story, Mallow claimed that she kept lashing out at them and even went ahead to put her hands on Abel. And so of course they decided to pull out a gun. Now as soon as Tamanika was struck, Mallow claimed that she and her sisters immediately tried to escape, but a male customer had interfered in the situation at that point and was holding a gun to Tania's head instead. So now with her sister in danger of being shot, she couldn't leave until the police eventually arrived. Now Mallow's story contained details that could change the trajectory of the case and introduce some elements of self-defense. But just to be sure that she wasn't making things up, another officer was assigned to speak to Abel, and what she revealed was even more unsettling. Just like with Mallow's story, Abel also confirmed that their order was initially incomplete, but she would also claim that Tamanika actually had a gun, which she threatened to shoot them with. Now surprisingly, even Abel didn't initially know that it was Tania who fired the shot, because according to her, she wasn't aware that Tania even brought a gun along to the restaurant. Now a few hours after they were taken into custody, Mallow and Abel would be released to go home, since they weren't actually the ones who pulled the trigger. Tania, on the other hand, would be moved to a special interrogation room where two investigators would attempt to get her to confess to her crime. However, Tania wasn't as cooperative as her sisters. As investigators Francis and McAllen walked into the interview room that day, they believed they were about to hear the first-person account of the incident. They started by reading Tania her Miranda rights, informing her that she could legally refuse to talk to them and instead request a lawyer. And Tania took that option. She told the officers that she decided to invoke her rights to remain silent, and she then asked to speak to her mom in order to begin the process of finding a good lawyer to represent her. Now, the identity of Tania's mother was never released to the public, but for the sake of the story, we'll call her Mary. The investigators had no choice but to respect her wishes and move out of the room to give Tania time to talk to her mother. And the conversation that ensued is nothing short of disturbing.
Tania, we've been waiting on you to call. Please help me. I need a lawyer or something. Okay, so listen. Do not don't write no statements. We've been talking to lawyers already. Don't talk about it over the phone. You are going to be okay. Milo and Apple are home. I want to come home. I know you do. You just got to calm down and stop crying. Did you write a statement? No. I just said I didn't want to talk. Yeah, that's good. Keep it like that.
All of the emotions Tania had been bottling inside of her heart would come rushing out once she'd heard Mary's voice. But listening to her mother talk would immediately explain how Tania became a cold-blooded killer. Instead of condemning her daughter's actions and showing some sort of empathy for the victim who lost her life, Mary was more concerned about rescuing her daughter out of legal trouble she'd gotten herself into. But judging by the next thing Tania said, it was obvious that Tania still didn't know how much trouble she was actually in. With tears in her eyes, Tania told Mary about how she refused to talk to the cops, and Mary then continued to reassure her that her lawyer would be visiting the jail to talk to her the next day. And Marie then asked her what charges had been filed against her, and once she started to list them, it became obvious that she wasn't going to be leaving the jail anytime soon. Now, the day after the incident, Tania would appear before a county superior court judge to find out if she would be getting released on bond while the trial was pending. But not surprisingly, her bond was denied. Now, unfortunately, from this point on, the case would become shrouded in mystery, because while some sources claim that she was eventually sentenced to 20 years for the manslaughter charge and 5 years for the firearms charge, there's no official source confirming whether this information is actually true or not. But realistically, it can be concluded that she definitely was sentenced to at least a couple of years for her crimes. But it's not as sick as stabbing your boss over 13 times. Now, I'm pretty sure a lot of us have had our own share of bad work experiences, and in most situations, the most effective solution is to try and switch jobs. But on July 10th, 2025, when a McDonald's employee faced a very similar situation, she decided to take a route that she would never come back from. Afeni Muhammad was a 26-year-old employee at a McDonald's branch on 9 Mile Road in East Point, Michigan. On the 8th of July, she posted a very lengthy rant, which was basically just her complaining about her manager at work.
I got sent home early yesterday. I got sent home early today by the same person. I'm telling you, she's a bully. This isn't funny. She could keep being a bully if she wants to, but that is going to catch up to her.
Now, the manager in question was 39-year-old Jennifer Harris, a single mother of 6 who'd worked at the McDonald's branch for 15 years and rose all the way up from a normal fry cook to the position of a manager. Because of how much she'd invested in her career, Jennifer was a pretty strict boss and expected the same work ethic that she had from others. 2 days after posting the rant, Afeni returned to work, and very shortly after clocking in, at around 7 in the morning, she and Jennifer got into another argument. Now, Afeni was furious, and as she drove back to her apartment, something in her snapped. She turned the car around and headed to a nearby park, and it was there that she would make up her mind to go back to her workplace and get her lick back once and for all. At 7:55 a.m., Afeni walked into the restaurant with a hooded mask and a French knife. She went to the back where Jennifer was and pulled out the knife and stabbed her about 15 times. According to the assistant prosecutor on her case,
she produced a weapon that was a knife longer than 3 inches, and she stabbed the victim multiple times, up to possibly as many as 15 times. eventually causing her death.
She then tried to escape, but on her way, a customer later identified as Devontae Pace, who was waiting for his order, noticed the blood all over Afeni. Devontae tried to stop her, but she started running. And that was when Devontae, who was a legal concealed carrier, pulled out his gun and fired shots up in the air to scare Afeni. But despite that, she still didn't stop. He then chased after her, and as soon as he caught up with her, he held her down at gunpoint, preventing her from escaping until East Point police arrived. Unfortunately, by the time the paramedics got to the scene, Jennifer had already lost way too much blood. They attempted to render first aid before transporting her to the hospital, but it was too late. Not long after she arrived at the hospital, Jennifer passed away. Afeni was immediately arrested and taken in for questioning, and once inside the interrogation room, the officers read Afeni her Miranda rights, but she actually decided to waive any form of restriction she was entitled to. Instead, she would begin speaking freely to the cops about the motive behind the attack. And just like in her rant video, Afeni would accuse Jennifer of being a bully and a racist, saying that she would often use her position to oppress and take advantage of the rest of the staff. However, when asked to provide any example of any racist statement Jennifer made towards her or anyone else, Afeni couldn't provide a straight answer. Afeni also claimed that she wasn't the only victim of Jennifer's bullying and maltreatment, and at some point during the video you can actually see her demonstrating the killing motion to the officers questioning her, pointing out all the spots where she stabbed Jennifer. But the most unsettling part of this interrogation was when the officers asked her how she felt while attacking Jennifer. Instead of being remorseful or apologetic, Afeni actually appeared excited. She told the officers that she felt free because she believed that she was fighting for her rights and trying to free herself from oppression. The officers then pressed further, asking her if she felt any form of remorse for what she had done. And in response, Afeni told the investigators that she was happy that Jennifer was dead. And as creepy as this may sound, it's not really surprising, since this wasn't actually the first time she would attack a person with a knife. Earlier in 2022, Afeni was arrested for stabbing her boyfriend in Alexandria, Virginia, during an argument. She was arrested at the time, but would end up receiving a suspended prison sentence and a year of probation. As for the Jennifer case, since Afeni confessed to committing the crime, moving the case was easy. During the court hearing that followed, the CCTV footage of the murder was played in full, and it was so disturbing that Jennifer's daughter, who was also present in the courtroom, left for a while, only to return with a knife in an attempt to stab Afeni right there in court. But just before she could get any closer to Afeni, the police tackled her and barred Jennifer's family from the courtroom for the remainder of the hearing. At first, Afeni's lawyers tried to argue that she was incompetent to stand trial on the basis of mental instability, and judging by her social media, there was clearly something up with her. She seemed to have been dealing with personality disorders, and would often make posts about how she wasn't being accepted for who she was. Afeni was also a rapper, and even had a music video titled "Accept Me for Who I Am." But the court, however, considered her competent to stand trial, and as of right now, she's currently facing charges of first-degree murder and carrying a dangerous weapon with unlawful intent. But at this point, the final judgment hasn't been passed yet, but judging by all indications, Afeni would probably be spending the rest of her life behind steel bars. Now this next case is by far the worst one that happened at a McDonald's. Till date, it's one of the most grueling fast food shootings in American history, and it all started from a case of purely managed mental health. James Oliver Huberty, the man behind the infamous incident, was born in Canton, Ohio on October 11, 1942. When he was 3, he contracted polio, and the disease ultimately altered his life. He was forced to walk with a limp and had to use leg braces all his life. Dealing with this type of condition made it hard for him to have any friends at all, and also made him a target for bullies. In 1950, when James was only 8, his father announced that he was moving the family to a farm he just purchased in the Pennsylvania Amish countryside. His mother, however, wasn't willing to completely abandon her present lifestyle to move to the rural area, so instead she decided to leave. Getting abandoned by his mother left young James devastated, and while he did learn to live without her, all the pain and trouble that he grew up in didn't just disappear. As James grew older, he became sadistic and absolutely hated humans. He would later go on to obtain a degree in sociology and would get a job as an embalmer afterwards. During James's time as an embalmer, he developed schizophrenia and would often hear voices of dead people, but he would actually end up getting fired after his boss noticed that he had almost zero emotions and would show no sympathy to families of the dead. After losing his job, he then moved to Ohio to work as a welder. He also got married to a woman named Edna, with whom he had 2 daughters. Nothing was extraordinarily good with James, but at least everything was normal at the time, until 1982, when tragedy struck. It was in that year that James was fired again by the new company he was working for, and because of this his family had to move away, and so they decided to settle in San Ysidro, where James got a job as a security guard. But by this time his mental health was long gone. He was distant and hot-tempered, and he would often maltreat his wife and children, slapping them and holding them at knife point. In addition to being violent, James also held several extremist views, especially when it concerned immigration. However, in the middle of this downward spiral, James would suddenly decide to turn his life around and take take control of his deteriorating mental health. And when he told his wife about this decision, she advised him to seek professional help. And so 2 days later, on July 17, 1984, he called a San Diego mental health clinic to book an appointment. The receptionist that responded to James claimed that he didn't sound troubled or in distress, so following protocol, she didn't record his case as an emergency situation and recorded his name to receive consultation after 48 hours. But unknown to both James Huberty and the receptionist, she'd misspelled his last name as Schuberty, which resulted in the entire conversation being lost in the system. Now, it might have seemed like a simple bureaucratic error, but that same mistake would cost 21 innocent lives. July 18, 1984. On the morning of the massacre, James started the day by settling a minor parking ticket. He then took his family to the San Diego Zoo, and after spending time together, they went for lunch at a McDonald's. But this one wasn't actually the one he attacked. This branch was located in Claremont, and according to Edna, James seemed to have been finding happiness, and the family's time together was peaceful. But by the time they got back home, he turned even colder, and this time said something she'd never expected. Immediately when James got back home, he began arming himself. He picked up a pump-action shotgun, a semi-automatic pistol, and an Uzi, with ammunition that could last for weeks, and then wrapped everything up in a cloth bag. He then went to his bedroom where Edna was and said,
"I want to kiss you goodbye."
Edna, who was preparing dinner, asked where he was going, and with absolutely zero emotion on his face, he replied,
"I'm going hunting for humans."
On his way out of the apartment, he then said to his daughters,
"Bye, I will not be coming back."
James then drove from his home and stopped at a Black Bear diner at first, but after a couple of minutes later, he changed his target to a McDonald's not very far away. When James arrived, the McDonald's was absolutely packed. He walked up to the counter and pulled out his shotgun and aimed it at his 16-year-old employee. And when this happened, the assistant manager simply said,
"Hey John, that guy is going to shoot you."
But before John knew, James had pulled the trigger. However, when he did, nothing actually happened. The shotgun had jammed, and at that point, John and the assistant manager thought it was a prank. A sick one though, so they decided to call the manager nonetheless. James quietly inspected his shotgun, with the coldest and most inexpressive of looks on his face. The manager, Neva Kane, came out from the kitchen, and just as she was about to ask James to leave, he pulled out his Uzi, shot at the ceiling, and sprayed bullets in Neva's face. The restaurant immediately went into chaos, and so did James. He walked around spraying bullets while screaming,
"Dirty swine, Vietnam ass," and that he killed 1,000 and was willing to kill 1,000 more.
The details of the massacre are sickening and sadistic to even read out. James shot at families that tried to hide under the tables, and that were trying to be protected by older people. His victim range was between 4 months and 74 years old. When the attack started, one customer, Victor Rivera, tried to talk sense into James, but this quickly irritated him, so he shot him 14 times while screaming that he should shut up. All of this began at 3:56 p.m., but it wasn't until 4 minutes later that the first emergency call was made. A staff member who was hiding managed to reach a call operator on a mobile phone and told her to call 911 about the incident. The operator then asked her to do it herself, but she explained that she couldn't, else James would shoot her. The operator agreed, but then gave the police the wrong McDonald's address and sent them to a different branch about 2 miles from the crime scene. Because of this, James had more time to continue the massacre, and at the same time, people outside weren't aware of the horror that was going on in the McDonald's. During this period, James also managed to kill 4 people outside the restaurant, including 2 11-year-old boys and 74-year-old Miguel Victoria Ulua and 69-year-old Ida Victoria. About 10 minutes after the first call, the police finally arrived at the scene, but James didn't make it any easier for the officers. He opened fire immediately and continued shooting inside the restaurant, plus the shattered glass on the window made it difficult for them to see through. According to the hostages, when the police arrived, James turned a radio to the news channel to follow up on what was going on outside, but after a while he got bored, so he decided to turn the radio to a music channel and started dancing. Now a fire truck tried to drive close to the scene to try to put out the burning kitchen, but immediately James sighted the truck and opened fire and injured one of the drivers instead. Now the massacre and hostage situation went on for 77 minutes, but at 5:17 p.m, Chuck Foster, a SWAT sniper from the San Diego Police Department, managed to get a clear sight of James from a rooftop position of a post office across the street. He didn't hesitate and immediately shot James in the chest, and almost instantly James' hour of horror ended. In an interview many years later, Foster described the shot.
"He had his Uzi with him. I was trying to get a good beat on him. I waited until he paused next to one of the bodies on the floor."
The aftermath was devastating. Multiple ambulances crowded in front of the McDonald's to rescue as many lives as they could, and at the same time the fire department was trying to put out the fire in the restaurant. On that day, James ended 21 lives and left so many others injured. This massacre immediately took over the headlines and gained a lot of sympathy from the public. Even Burger King, the franchise's biggest competitors, suspended their ads in solidarity, and a lot of contributions were made. And after that, the McDonald's was completely demolished as a way to erase the horror from the minds of the residents of that area. And now let's dive into the most disturbing crimes that happened at Disneyland. On May 31st, 2025, a video surfaced on the internet showing a violent brawl between some visitors at Disneyland. Although the video ended with an adult woman almost naked as a result of the fight, it all started with a family of 3 which we will call the Lees, and a couple who we will call Ming and Lan, for the man and the woman, respectively. According to reports, they were all in line for the ride known as Crazy Animal City at Disneyland, Shanghai, China. When Ming and Lan decided to take a photo together, the Lees then tried to move ahead, but obstructed Ming and Lan in the process. And this led to an exchange that went from subtle to heated, and within seconds, the conversation then went from heated to a physical confrontation. Before anyone knew what was going on, Ming, who was wearing a black t-shirt in the video, had already grabbed Mr. Lee, who was wearing a white t-shirt, and when the men wrestled each other, Lan joined in on the fight by yelling and pointing at Mrs. Lee, who was holding her daughter at the time. But before Mrs. Lee could make any moves, Lan decided to join Ming in hitting Mr. Lee, and this made Mrs. Lee move closer to the fight, trying to separate all 3 of them while still holding her daughter. Now soon Lan turned to Mrs. Lee, and in annoyance struck her daughter in the face. This caused Mrs. Lee to break down into tears and crouch on the ground, and as she cried, Lan went back to the 2 men to join in on the ongoing scuffle and helped to wrestle Mr. Lee to the ground. And as soon as Mrs. Lee saw her husband hit the ground, she pulled herself together, moved closer to the brawl, and reached out her arm to her husband to help him get up. Now at the time, the fight had already attracted a large audience who watched in shock, with some of them making an effort to end the fight, but all of their attempts to end the brawl ended in vain until the security personnel who worked at the park arrived at the scene to put an end to it all. Now at the end of everything, no one was actually critically injured, and so no one was actually arrested. However, these particular guests may later get punished by Disneyland itself, and that is because the park of course frowns at violent behavior from guests and has even added several rules about tourist behavior on their website.
Please show common courtesy both on-site and online. To fellow park guests are cast members, including but not limited to staff and performers and the Disney characters, and do not use profanity or offensive behavior.
Another rule states,
please respect fellow guests while queuing. Be careful not to bump into and push others in the queue. Guests are not permitted to use personal belongings of any kind, including but not limited to strollers, raincoats, and blankets, etc. To reserve viewing places while waiting for shows. The entire party should wait together.
Obviously, some of these rules have been broken, which is why the involved guests in the brawl could lose their access into the park for a limited or even an unlimited period of time. And this penalty is known to all guests through the Disneyland website, where it says,
we reserve the right to deny admission to any person, or to require a person already admitted to leave the park immediately without refund or compensation for failure to comply with any of the park rules, relevant rules, for unsafe, illegal, disruptive, or offensive behavior that causes suspension or attractions of entertainment performances, to ensure safety, security, or order, or if you consider that the circumstances so require.
While this crime involved a possible ban, this next case is worse, since it saw guests go crazy in the most disturbing way. On April 14th, 2025, some Disneyland guests had their dinner at Tiana's place completely ruined when another guest decided to be the main character in the most unsettling way. It was around 10 p.m. that night when the Anaheim police suddenly received a call to help Disneyland security kick out a man we will call Matthew, who was disturbing other guests at the restaurant. But before the police would arrive at the scene, a video of Matthew had started making rounds on the internet, and Matthew can be seen nakedly parading himself around Tiana's place and eventually climbing onto the roof of the restaurant. He also made gestures towards other guests and eventually threatened to check himself out of this world, leaving a little girl terrified and in tears. Which made this even more disturbing was that Disneyland is generally considered a family-friendly theme park that welcomes people of any age. Specifically, Tiana's Palace is known to be one of the places of attraction for kids in the park, and this is because it is a quick service restaurant modeled after the fictional eatery owned by Princess Tiana in the 2009 animated film, The Princess and the Frog. Now immediately after the park management learned about Matthew's behavior, they closed the restaurant completely and briefly evacuated the guests from the park's New Orleans Square. The park security then forced Matthew to come down from the roof at the restaurant before detaining him inside the park and then calling the police. After the police arrived, they started investigating the case and discovered that Matthew had engaged in substance abuse and that it was the substance that was responsible for his misbehavior. Although his name wasn't disclosed to the public, an Anaheim police spokesperson told CBS that he's a 38-year-old man from Calgary, Alberta, further revealing how grown Matthew actually was. Now eventually he was arrested for being under the influence of narcotics, trespassing, and public nudity. But while this was a crazy case for everyone involved, it wasn't the first time Disneyland had a guest ruining other people's experience. The It's a Small World attraction at Disneyland is one of the most loved and most patronized attractions in Disneyland history due to its endearing message of global unity and its large capacity. But on March 25th, 2023, this loved attraction would become a place of a disturbing public spectacle. It all began with guests having fun at the It's a Small World ride, when a man whom we will call Peter suddenly jumped out of one of the attraction boats he was riding in and started displaying erratic behavior. He started by stripping himself naked in the presence of everyone and then proceeded to wade in the water around the park where boats exited the ride. From there he went on to sit on the ride of the canal as he watched everyone look at him awkwardly. According to one Disneyland guest named Hunter Coast, who posted a video of Peter online, Hunter was in line for the ride with his family when his aunt directed his attention to the naked man. Hunter generally thought Peter was only being funny, but he soon realized that his behavior could ruin the beautiful experience for children waiting to get on the attraction. And this very concern made adult guests report Peter to Disneyland employees, who immediately stopped the ride and escalated the situation to the park security. Now they responded, but it still wasn't an easy task to get him off there. According to reports, it took about 45 minutes for 5 5 security guards and the Anaheim Police Department to have Peter contained. And after he was taken away from the attraction, the police conducted an investigation and determined that just like Matthew, he was also under the influence of a controlled substance. So Peter was then taken to the hospital as a precaution to be sure his condition wouldn't get any worse. And although his real identity was also kept secret, the police stated that he was a 26-year-old man who came to the park just like every other guest and actually had no ill intentions. This, however, didn't stop the police from arresting Peter and charging him with indecent exposure and being under the influence of a controlled substance. And while this case made the ride stop temporarily, this next one caused a massive evacuation since it involved thieves hiding in the park. In 2000, Disneyland launched the largest parking structure in the US with a capacity of 10,000 cars, and then followed it up with an additional 6,500 space garage in 2019, making visits and parking easy for guests to flock in and out of the park. However, what no one knew was that in just 6 years, this massive structure would become an almost perfect hideout for criminals. On March 24th, 2025, around 7:50 p.m., the Orange County deputies received a report about a stolen vehicle at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel on Pacific Coast Highway. But it wasn't just any vehicle, it was a Camaro ZL1, considered to be one of the coolest cars in the world, with a price tag of about $70,000. After compiling every information they needed about the missing vehicle, the deputies began their search, and in no time, they spotted it speeding at over 100 miles per hour on Interstate 5 through Irvine, California. Immediately, the police initiated a pursuit with cars and a helicopter in the air, and as the chase got more and more intense, the police kept closing in on the stolen vehicle, and it almost seemed like the alleged thieves had nowhere to go. But that was until the driver made a turn that left the officers on the edge of their seats. The driver would flee to Disneyland's 6,500 Pixar Palace parking structure without pausing for a second, and although it wasn't clear how he was able to swiftly drive past the garage attendant without getting stopped, his arrival at the park alerted the Anaheim and California Highway Patrol officers, who instantly took over the chase. The thieves were now somewhere inside the structure, which delayed the whole thing for hours. But by 8 p.m, the thieves decided to abandon the car, and the two then decided to run away on foot. Now the police actually continued the chase, and the parking structure, entrances, and exits were locked down for a thorough search. Unfortunately, this caused a significant inconvenience to the guests, as many of them would neither access their vehicles nor leave the park. Now thanks to a TikTok user named Danny McDuck, who made and uploaded a video of the scene on the platform, we were able to see what the park looked like while the investigation was going on. Now after the search, the two alleged thieves were caught, but there was still one more twist to the story, as the two suspects turned out to be children so young that the driver was taken to the juvenile hall while the passenger was released into the custody of a guardian. Thankfully, this case ended with nobody getting injured or killed, but this next one isn't as simple since it left bloodstains on Disneyland. 2023 was a special year for Disney fans, as their favorite entertainment company turned 100 years old. And to celebrate, Disney built and placed a 100th anniversary sign in several Disney World parks to mark the milestone and also to be used as a photo op. Now this triggered a wave of euphoria among fans who trooped to every Disney park to partake in the celebrations. But at the Magic Kingdom theme park, Walt Disney World Resort, some fans would cross the line, leaving behind horrific stains that would require a massive cover-up from Disney. It happened on May 15th, 2023, when a family we will call the Taylors asked another family who we will call the Browns to move over so they could have a family picture in front of Disney's 100th anniversary sign. But for unknown reasons, the Browns simply didn't want to move, prompting a member of the family to punch one of the Taylors in the face. From there, a serious fight ensued, attracting the attention of other guests in the park, and one of them decided to make a video that shows two families throwing punches at each other, with one man being wrestled to the ground and other family members pulling and shoving each other. The video, which lasted for about 37 seconds, ended with Disney workers and a security officer arriving at the scene to split them up. But by the time the intervention occurred, at least one person had been badly injured, and according to reports, that person was eventually given medical treatment. This was confirmed by a video shared by TikTok user Jay Frosty, showing the aftermath of the brawl. In the clip, Disney custodial teams can be seen spraying and covering what appears to be a huge bloodstain on the ground, indicating that at least one member of the two families had lost a lot of blood. Although no arrests were made, two identified people were given a trespass warning, which means that they will never be allowed into the happiest place on earth. But while this brawl only got those involved banned, this next case is even more intense since it involves multiple people getting arrested. Back in 2022, another intense brawl broke out in Magic Kingdom between two sets of families, leading to fans questioning whether the park was ever truly safe for its guests at all. According to reports, the fight ensued between a family wearing matching red and white outfits and another family we will call the Petersons. The two families were having a good time at the park until a member of the Petersons tried to rejoin their family in line for Mickey's PhilharMagic, a 3D musical attraction at Magic Kingdom. Now at first, no one knew what started the actual fight, but later one of the people involved, whom we will call Mike, reached out to a news agency called WDWNT to share the side of his story and submitted additional footage of the brawl, revealing shocking details about the incident. According to Mike, it all started with both the red and white family and the Petersons standing in line for Mickey's PhilharMagic. But then somewhere along the line, a member of the Petersons realized she left her phone in the electric conveyance vehicle and left the line to retrieve it. When she then got back to the queue and tried to join in with her family, the red and white family refused to let her join the line. She'd left, and instead they started pushing and shoving her. And although that wasn't enough of a trigger for a fight, the brawl didn't start until the end of the event they had all attended. After the Petersons exited the theater, they met the red and white family waiting outside, and from their hostile glare, it was obvious that they were waiting to confront the Petersons. Now, in an attempt to de-escalate the situation, one of the Petersons allegedly said to the red and whites,
"Listen man, we don't want trouble. We don't appreciate you guys pushing my younger sister."
And while it's not clear how the red and whites responded, the situation quickly went from a normal conversations to a shouting contest. And before anyone knew what was going on, the two families were already locked in a serious altercation. And not long after the brawl started, some bystanders caught it on camera and posted it on different platforms. Most of the uploaded videos lasted about 45 seconds, with no indication that the fight was coming to an end, and no security officers were seen trying to put an end to it. And this very fight made people start questioning the effectiveness of Disney's security system, with concerned guests making different posts emphasizing the need for them to improve their commitment to the safety to the fans. But according to a witness interviewed by Fox 35, she mentioned that security personnel did arrive at the scene when the fight was almost over, saying,
"We came upon it, and it appeared as though it took about 2 minutes for 2 security personnel to arrive. Deputies arrived probably about 5 minutes after that."
However, Mike's footage, which is about a minute and a half long, only shows other guests along with 2 cast members intervening to end the fight, and it was them who eventually broke it up successfully. According to reports, the security officer later came to escort everyone involved in the brawl to separate secure locations where they all gave their statements. But by then, a lot of damage had been done. The Petersons reported having some of their items broken or missing, with one member of their family taken away in an ambulance due to a large laceration on his chin. Other members of both families also suffered cuts and bruises, which were treated in the park. But that didn't stop the authorities from slamming them with appropriate punishments for disturbing the peace. After the deputies conducted their investigation, they found 3 people guilty of misdemeanor battery and arrested them, while Disney banned everyone involved in the fight from visiting the park ever again. But that still wasn't enough, as the company would take it a step further by adding a courtesy drop-down tab on its website under the section that says "Preparing for your visit." This section reads,
"Be the magic you want to see in the world. You must always remember to treat others with respect, kindness and compassion. Those who can't live up to the simple wish may be asked to leave Walt Disney World Resort."
And although this case ended with arrests, this next one is terrifying since it involves explosions. On May 28th, 2013, the day at Disneyland started like any other crowded summer afternoon, with families filling the walkways and music drifting through the air. But within moments, that illusion of perfection was shattered by an unexpected blast that forced thousands of guests to evacuate in fear. It all started when a Disney employee named Christian Barnes, who works at a vending cart outside of Toontown, concluded his shift and was going to be relieved by a colleague, whom we will call Harry. When Harry got to the vending cart that Christian had just left, he opened it to check what's left, but suddenly it exploded. While Harry and everyone else around were still trying to figure out what was going on, Christian took a water bottle from what was left of the exploded cart and found his way to the park exit. And before he left, he dropped the bottle in a trash can. Now, several minutes later, a cleaner removed the trash bag from the can and placed it on the floor and left it there to empty another can. But before he got back, the trash bag too had exploded. Although no one was injured in either explosion, they were enough to cause panic to the guests, who described the explosion as a loud boom. And the sound was also loud enough to alert the park officials to shut down Toontown, which is the affected area of the park, for about 3 hours, and decided to contact the police department and the bomb squad. Up until this point, nobody knew what caused these explosions, so it could be a simple prank or an actual attack on Disneyland waiting to escalate. To get answers, the officers investigated the case and found out that the explosions were from 2 dry ice bombs. One was placed in the cart and the other one in the trash bin. Fortunately, it wasn't a serious danger that could have led to any significant loss. And then at Disneyland, finding dry ice isn't actually that difficult, as the park uses it a lot for storing food, creating special effects, and outdoor vending carts like the one Christian managed. Also, crude dry ice bombs are actually common in Anaheim, as police have reported sightings multiple times in the city. So this means that the culprit didn't actually have to look far to get what he needed to make the actual bombs. Now, once the police determined the source of the explosions, the next job was to find the criminal behind the bombs. And due to Harry's account detailing how the first explosion occurred and the surveillance footage that showed Christian around the 2 explosion sites, the officers determined their first suspect. And so on May 29th, 2013, Christian was actually called in for questioning. Now, at this point, it was pretty clear that Christian was behind all of this, but initially it was unclear if Christian actually intentionally set off the explosion or if it happened by accident. But almost immediately after the interrogation started, he admitted to setting off the 2 dry ice bombs, and also explained how he used the water bottles to make the bombs and left them at the sites of explosions, and also explained how he used the water bottles to make the bombs. And as much as most explosions come with serious motives, surprisingly Christian mentioned that this was just an isolated incident with unexpected impacts, which in other words means it was just a one-time silly thing that he never expected would trigger a full bomb squad response. Now, after this confession, Christian was immediately arrested and was charged with a misdemeanor count of possession of a destructive device. This was actually a serious crime that would send Christian to jail for about 6 years. But before he was charged to court, he was held on a $1 million bail while he waited to appear before a judge. Now, Christian's father, Raymond Barnes, seemed to be displeased with how his son's case turned out, as he said in an interview with NBC4 that his son is the best kid anyone could ever ask for because he's never been in trouble and had no criminal record. He also mentioned that the authorities were blowing things way out of proportion, saying,
"It's just a little ice, hot ice. They're making a big deal out of nothing. I'm sure when the smoke clears, they'll see he's just like any other person. They just made a little mistake."
But unfortunately, according to Susie Brown, the director of media relations and external communications for Disneyland, cases like Christian's are taken very seriously, and so Christian may face actual jail time for his actions after all. Now, at the time, Christian still didn't know what would happen to him, but before long, Disneyland released a a statement about the situation, including an assurance of safety, saying,
"Reviews complete. Mickey's Toontown has been deemed all clear by local authorities. Guests are welcome to return."
And so on April 3rd, 2013, the attraction center opened normally once again, like nothing happened. And the next day, Christian appeared in Orange County's Superior Court and pleaded not guilty to his charges. And there, the prosecutors requested that his bail be reduced to $500,000, which the judge allowed. And afterwards set his bail hearing for June 13, 2013. Now, after the bail hearing, the judge first lowered Christian's bail to $50,000, and then ordered his release on the same day, stating that he believed Christian had no malicious intent. And so on November 4th, 2013, Christian would plead guilty to his charges and was immediately sentenced to 36 hours in jail, 3 years of informal probation, and 100 hours of community service, and a lifetime ban from Disneyland property. While this incident caused a few hours of panic within Disneyland, this next case is much worse, since it involves a violent offender and a smaller human. Disneyland Paris is not just Europe's most visited theme park, but also one of the most popular venues for beautiful beginnings. But without realizing it, the park once made a terrible decision of hosting a wedding that will only be remembered for horror. This story takes us to June 21st, 2025, when Disneyland Paris opened its gates to a groom, his bride, orchestra, a giant cake, and 100 guests in attendance before the opening hours. The ceremony kickstarted like every other weddings, until something really disturbing would catch the attention of some staff. The employee monitoring the events suddenly noticed the wedding had a very unusual type of couple, which included an adult groom and a small human as a bride. This led to the staff alerting the police, who came to put an end to the wedding immediately. Now, the police decided to arrest the group, the bride's biological mother, a 55-year-old Latvian man hired to be the bride's father, and a 24-year-old Latvian woman hired to be the bride's sister. And after the arrest, the police began investigating the situation and found out that the bride was in fact a smaller human who we will call Natalia. Now, more disturbingly, they also discovered that the groom had actually arranged a staged wedding by hiring Natalia to act as his bride and every other person in attendance. But the 100 paid extras thought they were attending a real wedding. Now, this was a very weird situation, but because the groom was the sole organizer of the event and had left everyone else ignorant of his plans, he was charged with fraud, breach of trust, money laundering, and identity theft. As for the other people involved, they were eventually let go by the authorities. And while every other charge is pretty self-explanatory, the groom was charged with money laundering because hiring Disneyland Paris for a wedding before the opening hours cost up to $153,000, which shows that he must have spent a lot of money to pull off the fake wedding. Also, the identity theft was a result of the groom fooling Disneyland by telling them that the wedding ceremony was real, taking things even further by booking the park with a fake Latvian identity. And on top of that, on the morning of the wedding, he used makeup to change his face, so as to look entirely different from himself. Fortunately, Natalia was not harmed both physically and intimately, but still staging a wedding with a person that wasn't of age is very weird. And it wasn't just Disneyland staff who found it strange, as one of the hired guests at the party would later express their shock during an interview with France Inner Radio.
"I saw the panic of the Disney people. Then through the window I saw a small human that was not of age with a wedding dress on. A woman was carrying her in her arms. That's when I understood that the bride was really young."
But while the investigators thought nothing else could be more shocking than the bride's age, they soon discovered that the groom was a well-known British intimately violent offender named Jaskan Jash, popularly known as Jackie Josh. And the French investigators found about Jackie's past records through the BBC, which had previously published investigations into him. And although the police and prosecutors didn't immediately name him, the BBC soon realized another article about him, stating that back in 2016, Jackie was found guilty of being intimately inappropriate with 2 female small humans in the United Kingdom after he lured them with alcohol while claiming to be a Hollywood film producer. And after he successfully lied to these innocent victims, he exploited them and even went ahead to filming the intimate moment without their consent. He then uploaded this video on a now deleted YouTube channel that stayed up for 4 years. One of the victims' family members said to BBC that it is very unfair for YouTube to allow such a video to stay up for that long, considering that the video destroyed the victim's life. Now, for this crime, Jackie was arrested and would eventually be sentenced to 4 years in prison. And after serving his jail time, he would be released in 2020. Now, in 2025, the French judicial authorities were notified of Jackie's previous convictions, but his rap sheet was even longer than they initially thought, as it would turn out he'd also been listed as a wanted man for breaching a harm prevention order and a breach of an intimate violent offenders register notification requirement by the Metropolitan Police in London. This was because after Jackie's release in 2020, he was placed under supervision by the London police. But even though he was under constant watch and his movement was restricted, somehow Jackie managed to pull off another massive stunt in London several years later. On October 17, 2023, Jackie faked a fake movie premiere at Leicester Square, and to make things worse, he hired hundreds of young people to act as his fans. According to reports, these people, who were aged were hired by an organization known as Project BRT from an agency called Jam 2000. These people were instructed to scream for Jackie and make an effort to touch him as he walked by, and some of them were reported to have freely touched his hands and back as he paraded up and down in different outfits. In addition to the small humans, Project BRT also booked about 100 young women between the ages of to 24 from another company known as Universal Extras to also act as Jackie's fans. Now this is so extremely weird that the BBC reached out to the older cast of the event to ask questions about how they got hired, and at the end of the interview, text messages sent by Universal Extras show the actors were paid £85 to act as Jackie's diehard fans, who cried, tried to reach him, and passed out from loving him excessively. They were also asked to appear in different costumes, including clubbing high school uniform, Harry Potter type of look, and pajamas. Now while this sounds like a simple task to perform, the story became really troubling when the cast members mentioned that throughout the event, no one actually knew Jackie's true identity. It wasn't until the fake premiere was over that Universal Extras sent a couple of shocking emails to the actors. The emails stated that they just found out that one of the cast members may have had a criminal conviction in the past, and warned them to never speak to the media about it, claiming that it would be considered breach of their contracts. While the actors remained tight-lipped throughout the event, the agency would later send yet another email on November 2nd, 2023, saying that it had conducted an extensive investigation and had reported every concern to the police. The agency also assured the actors of their safety by attaching the alleged response of the police that says,
"There's no cause for concern in relation to artist safety, and there were no restrictions placed on this individual, preventing him working with or being near any of our artists, including those under 18.
But it turned out that this wasn't the case, because after the BBC found out about these emails, it reached out to the police for confirmation, and what was discovered was nothing short of shocking. The BBC was told that Jackie had been charged with 2 counts of failing to comply with the notification requirements of the Intimate Violent Offenders Register, which means he didn't register a new passport and failed to notify the authorities of his trip 7 days before he departed. In addition, he was also charged with breaching his harm prevention order because he didn't provide a mobile phone for inspection. And after the BBC spoke to 2 young adults who attended the fake premiere, it was revealed that they were also clueless about the nature of the production they were paid to attend. All of these were documented in the BBC's article, and just as expected, it went pretty viral. But nothing would be heard of Jackie until June of 2024, when a parent saw him sharing gifts to young people outside dance auditions for another production. This parent recognized him immediately and reported him to the police, prompting his immediate arrest. However, Jackie was soon again released, since his offense was considered minimal, although it ended up attracting further investigation by the BBC. And then Jackie moved from the UK to France, where he would organize the infamous Disney wedding that landed him in much bigger trouble. Now at the time of this video, Jackie remains in custody and hasn't been sentenced yet. But while this violent offender was just a one-time guest at Disneyland, this next case takes things up a notch, since the criminal is a Disney employee. On March 31st, 2023, a female cast member at Disney Studios, Florida, whom we will call Laura, made a report to the Orange County Sheriff's Office about a male employee who she caught filming a female guest inappropriately. After receiving this report via a phone call, the officers called in Laura to give them details of how the incident occurred. In a redacted video, Laura told the sheriffs that she was in Dog Honor's shop, standing next to the register when she saw the male employee acting strangely. The man was there to direct a queue of guests waiting to buy lightsabers while holding different menus of the product, and at the time, a female guest whom we will call Amanda was next in line to purchase the lightsabers. But before she could actually buy anything, the employee suddenly dropped one of the menus he was holding, which fell directly in front of him, and that was the moment the unimaginable happened. Laura told the sheriffs that she suspected that the employee was taking pictures of Amanda's underskirt, and when the sheriffs asked why she thought so, she said,
"You know he was taking photos."
Well, in
did
my
you see a light flash?
I
or
did not see a flash,
okay.
but
You hear it clicking, or
no, it was very
just
loud
assumption,
in there.
right?
It is my assumption,
Right.
yes.
Okay.
Especially because there was no need for him to reach that way.
Of course.
To pick up his menu,
Right.
and it was no need for him to have his phone out either.
Okay.
And there's no phone in that position either, so
I
it
understand.
wasn't like a work phone or anything.
Right.
Laura was also asked if the employee knew that she saw him, to which she answered,
I don't know if he knows that I saw him, but as soon as he did it, he like put his phone back away, and then he turned around and made eye contact, and then he turned back around really fast. And then that's when I called my peers and reported.
After the interview, the officers then went down to Disney Studios and searched for the said employee, and in no time they found him, informed him that they were there to question him, and conducted a thorough search of him. They confiscated his personal possessions, including his phone and his ID card, revealing his identity to be a 26-year-old man named George Diaz Vega. Afterwards, he was then led to a vacant room in the studio where he was interviewed by the sheriffs. One of the officers started by telling him the reason for the meeting with him and proceeded to ask them about the reported incident. Now for a while, he was really cooperating with them, but later told them that he had a confession to make on one condition.
Can you close the door? I wanna express. I wanna tell you the whole thing.
Sure. Hang on a second.
If you close the door.
Oh, sure. Come on in, Chris. Close the door. I mean, you don't have to talk to me if you don't want to. I'm just saying. Okay.
I have a confession for me.
Okay.
Although his confession part was redacted, according to an arrest statement,
we know that George admitted that he's been taking videos of dresses/skirts of unknown females in the Disney World theme parks for approximately 6 years.
This was a very shocking revelation, but George's immediate request after his admission is even weirder, as he expressed concern for his mother and longed to be home.
I don't mean this in a bad way, bro. Because I love my mom a lot. You think I'll get home?
Well, we're just gonna have the detectives. It kind of depends on how long you sit and talk to the detective. Once they come out and talk to you, because they're gonna want to see if you can write everything out and all for them. So that'll be up to them. But we're not going to say anything to your mom.
Now, when the actual detectives arrived, George told them everything he just said to the sheriffs, and in addition mentioned that he had over 500 illicit videos on his device, which he'd filmed by himself for personal gratification, because he could no longer find similar videos on online websites. Now, to probably bail himself out of the situation, George then apologized for what he'd done, and told the investigators that he had a mental health condition, saying,
"I know what I did was wrong, and I do not mean to cause any harm. I have autism, and the times I was doing it, I didn't know the consequences."
But unfortunately for George, the information wouldn't save him, as the officers actually soon connected another reported incident to him. Now, a day before this interview, on March 30th, 2023, the sheriff's office received a similar report about a male Disney employee, who was of course later identified as George, intentionally making a doll fall so he could film another female guest's underskirt. And now initially it felt like George's legal case started right here, but according to reports, there was yet another case prior to the March 30th case, because George was actually at the time accused of recording up the skirt of a female co-worker with his phone, which led to an internal investigation at Disney. But eventually the company didn't actually fire him though, but instead just changed his role. Now, even before that, on March 25th, 2023, George allegedly captured an upskirt video of a female smaller human, whom we will call Ivana, while she was buying a toy from the gift shop. Ivana was there with her grandmother, who caught George in the act and confronted him. And George didn't even deny his crime, but instead begged Ivana's family to keep it a secret, saying,
"I've been fired for this before. Please don't call the police. I promise I won't do it again."
And even once Ivana found out what happened, she began crying, screaming, vomiting, and would eventually suffer a panic attack. And now, barely a week later, who didn't spare him this time around, but went straight to the sheriff's office instead. With that, the officers located the victim, Amanda, to inform her about the incident, and asked her if she wanted to prosecute George. Now, Amanda actually hesitated initially, but would soon agree to press charges in order to save the other people from being George's victims. And so the officers arrested George and charged him with 2 counts of video voyeurism, which means to secretly film another person's or intimate activities without their consent, especially in areas or situations where the victim expects privacy. And immediately after his arrest, Disney would also completely terminate his appointment, rendering him jobless once again. Now, in court, George pleaded not guilty, and he was eventually released on a $2,500 bond, waiting for the actual outcome of his case. But before he could actually know his punishment, in June 2023, officers responded to a report about a man later identified as George, who was engaged in lewd behavior at Publix. According to a witness, whom we will call Diane, who spoke to the deputies, she initially noticed George when he started following her, and her husband, whom we will call Peter, around the store. George's movements became concerning when he moved behind Diana and knelt to her side with his phone in his hand. Afterwards, he simply left the area. Now, Peter was worried that George would have taken pictures of his wife, so he and Diana followed George just to be sure. And eventually the two found George at the checkout point and confirmed their suspicions right there. George was allegedly filming another woman underneath her dress while standing behind her in the queue. And so Diane immediately yelled at George to stop, which made him try to leave the store hurriedly. Peter actually caught up with him and seized his phone. Now, at the moment, George began to plead with them not to call the police, saying he had a record and was previously sacked for the same offense. And in the process of talking himself out of the situation, George would then actually suddenly run away in his car, leaving Peter and Diane with the phone he'd used to commit a crime. And so while the couple waited for the deputies, Peter actually looked through the phone and found pictures of his wife's dress, her underwear, and her face, confirming that George had indeed taken pictures of her. Once the officers arrived, they also looked through the store's CCTV footage and affirmed that George filmed Diane and another woman inappropriately. And even though George was now gone via his car's plate number, the deputies were actually easily able to locate George, who was once again arrested. Now, he was sent to county jail on a $5,000 bond this time. In addition to that, the court ordered him to stay away from every public store. Now, after George was actually released on bond again, the case proceeded slowly until March 21st, 2025, when Ivana's family decided to file a civil lawsuit against Disney and George for negligent hiring, negligent retention, invasion of privacy, and more, seeking at least $50,000 in settlement. Now, up until this video was made, the lawsuit remained active, with no indication of settlement or dismissal, and George is still yet unpunished for his crimes. And while it's not common for cases like this to stay pending for a long time, the next case is much worse, since it sent the whole country into a state of great fear. On April 12, 1995, a padded envelope labeled videotape with no return address arrived on the desk of the Disneyland executive secretary. At first, it seemed harmless, until curiosity led her to play the video, revealing a message that would set off a nationwide panic. The 8-minute and 51-second video opened with an anonymous person behind the camera, filming a newspaper from the Orange County Register with the date April 1st, 1995 on it. The particular report filmed was headlined,
"Man charged with spraying irritant in Disneyland,"
and it detailed an incident that happened in the month where a 21-year-old man allegedly released a harmful substance in the Space Mountain ride that made about 33 people sick instantly. The caption on the videotape in relation to the news article says, "Good boy," and the camera soon moved to a table of old black and white photographs of unknown people captioned "Dead Guest" before the screen went blank. Immediately, the words nerve gas and made easy appeared, and the next thing we see is what looked like a temporary and low quality chemical lab. On the table was a pair of tongs, an aluminum pot and bottles of liquid, and a clock on the table was pointing to number 9 with a date underneath that reads April 14th, 1995, which was 2 days after the arrival of the tape at Disneyland. A glove hand then eventually started to work with the chemicals and eventually pulled out small glass pots of a pink substance and another colorless substance. Next thing that appeared on the screen was a refrigerator. It had a yellow container of antifreeze and other unknown items wrapped in tinfoil. Towards the end of the video is a shot that was filmed from a motel across the street from Disneyland, close to where the parking lot used to be, and once again the words dead guest appeared on the screen before the video went blank. At the end of the video, a Spanish TV show from 1988, Cámara Infragante, played, and it made the whole video seem like it originally contained the TV show, which the anonymous person recorded on. Now this content immediately sent chills down the secretary's spine and prompted her to immediately remove the tape, all while being careful to ensure any potential fingerprints were preserved. The secretary then took the tape to the security manager, who then informed the higher authorities. Immediately, the FBI, Anaheim police officers, Orange County bomb squad, and public health officials were deployed into the park in anticipation of a possible attack. And what followed was a tightening sense of fear as everyone involved braced themselves for the uncertainty ahead. Now the officers involved were all given chemical warfare gear, including gas masks from stockpiles off the marine base at El Toro, showing the magnitude of the situation. And from the moment the officers were in position, the security at the park was tightened, as everybody was thoroughly searched who went in during the period. Now being an Easter weekend, it was one of Disney's busiest weeks, with a lot of guests and attendance, which at the same time seemed like the perfect time for perpetrators to penetrate into the park by blending in with the crowd. Now the tension was intense around that time, not only because of the videotape itself, but also because 3 weeks before the tape arrived at Disneyland, a Japanese cult known as Om Shrinjinko cult unleashed a lethal nerve agent called sarin on commuters in Tokyo. This attack sent 13 people out of this world, and as a result made law enforcement around the world be more careful. Now while the news of this attack generated a widespread panic, now some sources capitalized on it by spreading rumors that the Tokyo police said that the 2 men associated with the cult had flown to Los Angeles shortly before Easter, and the same sources also claimed that both men were arrested upon arrival in LA, but no one actually knew their whereabouts at the time Disneyland received the threats. But the rumors would do more damage than good to the public. The FBI debunked the story but never commented about the reason for deploying the officers and bomb squad to Disneyland. And of course the guests didn't know about the VHS tape, which simply left the public unconvinced that the cult members weren't roaming around freely in the United States. To worsen the situation, a Japanese National Police Agency official also declined any comment concerning 2 Japanese men who were reportedly questioned at the Los Angeles airport. Now another reason for the internal panic of the Disney company was the result of Disney receiving bomb threats because of a movie the company released around the same time named Priest. The Catholic organization was really pissed about the movie and protested against it because it featured a homosexual priest. But while Disneyland was packed with the US military troops and guests roamed around the park wondering why the security was tightened, danger loomed in another part of the country, and what happened next was far more tragic than anything imagined.
We just had some kind of explosion downtown.
Now 5 days actually passed after April 14th, the supposed date of the attack, so all was good until now. But instead, the city of Oklahoma witnessed a domestic terrorist attack when a massive truck bomb detonated outside of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma, and the attack sent 168 people out of this world and injured another 680. And on the same day, an anti-government extremist, Timothy McVeigh, was arrested, convicted, and later executed, whilst accomplice Terry Nichols was sentenced to life imprisonment. And while President Bill Clinton was addressing the attack, he also hinted at the videotape threat, saying,
"There was one recent incident with which I was intimately familiar, which involved a quick and secret deployment of a major United States effort of FBI and FEMA and Public Health Service and Army personnel. We went to the place and we were ready. We were ready to try to prevent it, and if it occurred, we were ready to respond."
And while the president never explicitly mentioned Disneyland, the White House would actually later confirm that he was referring to the park threat. Now after this press conference, the authorities decided to keep the details of the incident under wraps, so the general public still wasn't sure what to believe. However, on April 22nd, 1995, the FBI finally announced that the VHS threat was a hoax, since nothing happened on April 14th, which was the targeted date, and even 8 days later, the situation remained the same. The announcement finally marked the end of this potential threat. Now until now, the public actually never saw the actual VHS tape recordings, and the mysteries around this would only grow stronger as days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, with nobody knowing what exactly was said in these tapes. And eventually, those looking for answers started to lose interest as time went on. But in 2019, this exact videotape would come to life once again after a VHS collector named Todd Berghoven stumbled upon it while looking through a Goodwill thrift store in Portland, Oregon. Todd generally collects old videos that have been lost to time and posts them on his YouTube channel named Dr. RPVHS. And as soon as he found this video and watched it, he knew he had found something different from his usual finds. He then wrote in the video description,
"Of all the haunted VHS tapes I've ever found, this one is the most haunted."
And Todd then asked the online investigators to help him solve the mystery. In the video, the name Jerry Hill was written on the tape, together with the printed label 199MNY252958. And once again, this discovery sparked curiosity among those who knew about the hoax, with the new generation joining the train of intrigue. And more than the question of
what happened decades ago, ago
were other questions like,
who is Jerry Hill? Why did he have the tape? And what do the numbers mean written on it?
And before long, the internet, specifically a channel named Barely Sociable, were able to provide some answers, including the first 3 digits, 199 likely being an FBI classification known as Foreign Counterintelligence Terrorism, while NY suggests that the case was handled by the New York field office. And it was later revealed that the location was one of the reasons the authorities didn't take the threat lightly, and this was because the Japanese cult had a base in New York City, which of course made the FBI believe that this tape might have ties to the group. As for the name on the tape, it belongs to a former FBI agent named Jerry Hill, who worked in the Portland area. According to Jerry Hill's relative, who spoke to news outlets, Jerry used to work on terrorism cases, which explains why it was possible for him to have his name on it. But by 2017, Jerry died, and the tape ended up at a Goodwill store. And while no one visits Disneyland with the fear of explosions, this next case made the guest experience extremely traumatic. When it comes to graduation ceremonies, they usually begin with a lot of excitement and end in the same way. But on June 13, 2024, what started as a celebration at the Walt Disney Concert Hall ended in the most horrifying way. This wasn't a regular graduation ceremony, but a program known as Operation Graduation, which is a collaborative ceremony organized by the Los Angeles County Probation Department and the Los Angeles County Office of Education. It celebrates high school students who've earned their diploma in juvenile detention, probation camps, and community schools. The ceremony was organized for over 100 Los Angeles County high school graduates, including more than 24 youths who are on probation. And the actual graduation ceremony began on a good note, as expected, with the detained probation youth being closely watched and eventually escorted out of the auditorium. They were then placed in a secure holding area after their program had been concluded. But things were just about to take a dark turn. While the ceremony was coming to an end, someone from the audience suddenly jumped over a second-story balcony at the concert venue and attacked a community graduate. Instantly, things got even worse when someone else leaped off the stage into a group of people, resulting in a massive brawl. And Brianna Valdez, one of the graduating students who just climbed the stage when the fight started, expressed her shock in an interview, stating how intense the fight actually was.
It was really scary. They were all jumping. They got on top of each other and they fell off of the stage.
Now, before the situation would get even worse, the security personnel at the venue contained it, and eventually no serious injuries were reported. But while everyone tried to catch a break and return to their homes, another fight broke out inside the concert hall, and this time it involved a firearm. According to witnesses Raul Valdez and Javonte Jameson, the second fight started just as suddenly as the first one, but with multiple gunshots being fired, leaving everyone scared to death.
Coming out of the ceremonies, and there was a car right on the other side of the cars that were parked, and we just saw shooting, and then saw the smoke and everything, and everybody just got down on the ground.
Once again, law enforcement reacted swiftly to the situation and had 4 people arrested, bringing peace to the chaotic situation. And although the report stated that the fight was between students from different communities, some witnesses believed it all happened for a different reason.
It's like we're here for a happy moment and it's just ruined with gang activity.
Despite the rapid shootings, no life was actually lost. But the same can't be said about the next case, since it involves someone losing their life in the most unusual way. On October 5th, 2023, Jeffrey Piccolo had dinner with his wife, Dr. Kenneth Porn Tang Swan, and his mother, Jackie Piccolo, at Disney Springs, after which the three went their separate ways. Now, approximately 45 minutes later, Jeffrey would receive a disturbing call, stating his wife had just collapsed and died from food allergy. Jeffrey couldn't believe his ears, not only because his wife was young and healthy, but because he was sure about an hour ago that they wouldn't be having any food allergy issues. That was because Jeffrey and his family carefully and intentionally chose the Ranglan Road Irish Pub restaurant because they believed the restaurant, and especially Disney, wouldn't be careless about food allergies. For context, Disney is known as one of the most allergy-safe places to visit, at least since 2015, when Disneyland and Walt Disney World Resorts introduced allergy-friendly menus. And fast forward to 2017, Disney would even get recognition from the Food Allergy Research and Education Group as an industry leader in providing safe, quality dining experiences to guests with allergies and special diets. And this is even boldly stated on the Disney website food blog for anyone who wants to actually read it. This was really important to Jeffrey and his family, and it in a way influenced their choice of restaurant because Canuck Porn was highly allergic to dairy and nuts. This means that one wrong ingredient, without them knowing, could very well mean chronic pain or even worse, death for Canuck Porn. Now, once they settled in, they informed the waiter about her allergy, and he assured all of them that they would prepare dishes that are safe for her. And so they ordered a vegan fritter, scallops, onion rings, and a vegan shepherd's pie. Now, when the server actually returned with the food, some of the items didn't actually have the allergen-free flags in them, which made Jeffrey and Canuck Porn question the waiter again about the allergens, to which he responded with an assurance that the food was safe. And after assuring them again and again, the three decided to eat their food and went their separate ways after. Jeffrey took the leftover food to their room, while his mom and Canuck Porn went out to shop. Now outside, Canuck Porn and Jackie actually decided to shop separately, and as soon as Jackie was done shopping, she called Canuck Porn on the phone to know if she was done as well, but Canuck Porn wasn't actually responding, and so Jackie thought that she had simply headed to the hotel, so Jackie decided to do the same. But when she got to the room, Canuck Porn was nowhere to be found, and so Jackie called her again, and this time it was answered, but not by Canuck Porn herself, but by a stranger who told Jackie that her daughter-in-law had just slumped at the store and had been taken to the hospital. Jackie and Jeffrey would then rush to the hospital, where the witnesses who followed Canuck Porn told them that she suddenly began to have difficulty breathing and eventually collapsed. According to the observers, Canuck Porn actually self-administered an EpiPen before one of them called 911. But unfortunately, after a period of waiting, Jeffrey and and Jackie met the doctor in charge, who told them that Kenneck Porn had died. According to them, her death was a result of a severe and fast-acting allergic reaction due to the elevated levels of dairy and nuts in her system. This news of course made Jeffrey was shocked because of the conversation he and his family had with the waiters who served them at the Raglan Road Irish pub. And so Jeffrey decided to file a lawsuit against the restaurant and Walt Disney Parks and Resorts, accusing both of negligence. Raglan for preparing the food improperly and Disney for failing to train their employees to make sure they prepare allergen-free food when requested. Now initially Disney actually argued that the restaurant is neither owned nor operated by the company, saying in their email statement that they're defending the company against any attempt to include them in a lawsuit meant to be solely against Raglan, because in reality Raglan Road is not owned and operated by Disney, but by the Great Irish Pubs Florida Incorporated. However, Jeffrey's attorney countered that the lease agreement between the parties is in part evidence of Disney's right of control over the actions of Raglan Road, and with that Disney was still forced to remain in the case. But this is when Disney decided to pull out their ace card. On May 31st, 2024, Disney attorneys devised another means to dismiss Jeffrey's lawsuit, and this time they chose to dig up the terms and conditions he agreed to when signing up for the Disney Plus streaming service in 2019. According to Disney, Jeffrey created a Disney Plus account on his PlayStation and agreed to the terms of use that states users agree to settle any disputes with the company out of court via arbitration. And the company also claimed that 2019 wasn't the only time Jeffrey agreed to such a contract, but also in 2023 when he bought Disney Plus theme park tickets using his Disney account. And Jeffrey's attorneys actually confirmed that truly Jeffrey did create a Disney Plus account in 2019, but he actually canceled the subscription during the trial and never used it afterwards. They then responded to Disney's claims, saying that it is wrong to actually state that a person who signs up for a 1-month free trial without expanding beyond the trial period will have to waive the right to a jury trial forever, and instead will agree to arbitrage any dispute against Disney and its affiliates. In addition to that, Jeffrey's lawyers also argued that Jeffrey agreed to these terms on behalf of himself and not his wife, whom the lawsuit is actually about. Now when it became public that Disney was trying to use this tactic as a get out of jail card, they faced a ton of backlash with different tweets and posts, like the one from a user named Evan Loves Swerves saying,
"Remember that a woman died in Disney World, and Disney argued in the wrongful death lawsuit that they weren't liable because her husband had signed up for Disney Plus. They're an evil company."
And another user said,
"The tragic death at Disney World due to a food allergy shows it's evident that Disney does not prioritize guest safety." Now they're reportedly using Disney Plus terms of service as a legal loophole to dismiss the lawsuit. This negligence is unacceptable. It's time we hold Disney accountable and demand they take real action to protect their guests. No more excuses.
And besides the call out tweets, some YouTubers also made videos about the situation, condemning Disney. One of them was Penguin Z, who said this concerning the situation.
"I've said for years now, one of the most evil companies on the planet is Disney. I imagine the board of directors is a who's who of supervillains. You probably got Mickey Mouse right next to Lucifer in that seat. It is always shocking to see just how low they'll stoop for the sake of a couple extra doubloons."
Now it soon became a widespread issue, and Disney knew that their reputation was totally on the line. And so to salvage the situation, the company filed a notice to withdraw the motion in an email to the Associated Press saying,
"At Disney we strive to put humanity above all other considerations. With such unique circumstances as the one in this case, we believe the situation warrants a sensitive approach to expedite a resolution for the family who've experienced such a painful loss."
Now currently the case is still ongoing, with no guarantee that this will actually end soon. Now this was a disturbing and unexpected end to a person's life, but it's nothing compared to the next case since it involves a person's life ending mysteriously. It's late June 1974, a time Disneyland was exceptionally buzzing with people for its recently debuted variety show known as America Sings. Unknown to anyone at the time though, just 1 week later, this same show that brought smiles to thousands of faces would end up taking the life of an employee in the most disturbing way. That employee was 18-year-old Deborah Gail Stone, the first child of Bill and Marilyn Stone. Deborah was described as an athletic and smart kid who graduated from Santa Ana High School in the top 10 percentile of her class. After graduation, she then enrolled at Iowa State University with so much excitement and enthusiasm for her future. However, what Deborah truly needed was far more than her inbuilt abilities and euphoria. She needed money to live through college, since she was far away from home. And being a teenager, Deborah of course only had her gaze fixated on the coolest place any person would want to work at, and that place was Disneyland. Now once Disneyland started taking applications for summer jobs, Deborah and her friends decided to apply, hoping they would be selected. And surprisingly, Deborah actually got the job she desired, and so in no time she was already functioning in one of the most exciting spots. Now Disneyland had just debuted the animated variety show known as America Sings.
Yankee Doodle travel south, riding on a riverboat, playing a tune and singing out, it sounded like a...
It was a show that paid tribute to America's musical history and performed it by rotating the theater where guests sat around a central stage in 6 steps, just like a ride. Altogether, the show lasted 24 minutes and featured 4 acts, each of which was a medley of tunes performed by audio animatronic animals. Now, unlike many other rides in the park where Disney workers only stayed behind the scenes, certain rides required someone beautiful and smart enough to welcome patrons before the start of the show and bid them goodbye after the theater had completely rotated around the 6 musical scenes.
Welcome to our presentation of America Sings. We have a few last reminders before we start. Please, no smoking or eating, and especially no flash photography here in our theater.
And so for American Sings, Deborah, a pretty young and upbeat woman, seemed like the ideal cast member, and so she mastered her job as the show hostess. And on July 8th, she was placed on the evening shift. But before the show could actually start, Deborah had something else to be excited about. Her boyfriend had just proposed to her earlier that day, and so she called her parents to ask if it was okay to get married. Now, according to her parents, they were happy for her, which means they gave her their blessings. After the positive response, Deborah went ahead to do her job, and the show began like every other of its kind, but its end came with a tragic twist. Around 10:30 p.m., the guests had just experienced the last musical scene, and the stage was moving into the position to begin a new cycle, when one of the guests, Daniel Robinson, and saw what looked like a little child was being pulled between the moving walls. And once the stage stopped moving, the guests informed the operators to rush to the scene, only to be met with a gruesome sight. Somehow, the two passing walls had crushed Deborah to death, leaving her remains almost unidentifiable. Now, why Deborah was between those walls has stayed a mystery for over 5 decades, with loads of speculations and myths being passed down from one generation to another. While some believe Deborah's hair might have been caught in the moving walls, other hosts of the show had claimed that it wasn't unusual for staff to playfully hop from one wall to another. But in Deborah's case, no one ever saw her doing that on the night of the incident. Now, to Deborah's family, the right safety features weren't enough, and so they filed a lawsuit against Disney. And during the course of the investigation of the case, it was revealed that American Sings had a dangerous flaw, which could have made it easy to become a victim of the moving walls. According to reports, the American Sings Theater was initially used for Carousel of Progress, which was a rotating theater show about the history of American technological progress. Now, the difference between those two shows is that the Carousel of Progress was a rotating theater, while American Sings was a stationary theater with rotating stages. So in other words, Carousel of Progress rotated in a clockwise direction, in a way that allowed the center stage to rotate without the walls colliding, while American Sings rotated in an anti-clockwise way, which means that the walls would clash as the center rotated while moving guests from one stage to another. Now, eventually Disney settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, which Deborah's parents called a small settlement. Now, according to reports, the company added safety lights that would alert someone if they were getting too close to the danger area, ensuring the safety of other employees, until the eventual shutdown of the show in April 1988. And while no one witnessed how Deborah lost her life, the next case is more troubling since it involved a guest sending another one out of this world in the most brutal way. Long before 1981, Disneyland had launched a grad night program that brings every Southern California high school senior together to celebrate their graduation. This event is one of the reasons Disneyland had a lot of teenagers in the park on March 7, 1981. However, at the same time, the Roar Corp, a defense and aerospace firm, was also hosting a private after-hours party for their employees and their families at Disneyland. One of the attendees was 18-year-old Mel Christian Yorba, whose father, Edward Joseph Yorba, was an employee at Roar Corp before his death in 1978. While Mel and his friends were having fun around the park, he crossed paths with 28-year-old James O'Driscoll, who was there with his girlfriend, Julie Holdener, at the Tomorrowland section. Now suddenly, for whatever reason, Julie told James that Mel had either pinched or fondled her unprovoked. And this got James really mad, that he had to confront Mel about it, and from there the situation turned into a scuffle. Now during this fight, Mel and his friends later managed to run away, but James just simply wasn't satisfied with that. According to Julie, she told James to let go of the situation, but James instead ran after Mel and his friends. He got a hold of Mel again and continued to fight it, but before anyone could stop them, James actually pulled out an 8.5-inch knife and stabbed Mel in the chest. As expected, Mel started bleeding profusely, leading the security guards off the park to rush to his aid. And that moment, it dawned on James that he'd landed himself in serious trouble, and so he decided to flee the scene. He first paused at the Sleeping Beauty castle to toss the knife he used into the moat, and proceeded to hide his blood-soaked shirt in a women's restroom trash can. And from there, James ran to the Adventure Railroad, where he curled up in a fetal position to hide himself. Now at first, the attention was actually divided. While some officers were looking for James, some had their attention on the dying Mel, who was unconscious from bleeding so heavily. The security guards called a nurse, employed by Disneyland, named Elizabeth Miko, for intervention, but instead of actually giving him first aid and calling an ambulance, Elizabeth suggested that Mel be taken out of the park to a hospital immediately. And so Mel, who'd already bled for about 20 minutes, was then taken into a park van without any first aid kit and driven to the hospital. And it took actually 10 minutes to locate one named Palm Harbor. Unfortunately, by the time they arrived, Mel already bled out and was pronounced dead on arrival. Now, while all of this was going on, the officers who stayed at Disneyland kept looking for James and eventually found and arrested him. And Julie, who was not reported to be in hiding, was also arrested. However, the next day, she was then released without getting charged due to lack of evidence. James, on the other hand, was charged with taking a life, to which he pleaded not guilty. On April 13, 1981, while James awaited trial, Mel Yorba's family would file a lawsuit against Disneyland, seeking $60 million in damage. According to the family lawyer, John Luedo, the suit was not intended to punish the amusement park, but to ensure that a similar incident would not be handled the same way in the future. And by handled the same way, Mel's family meant that Mel's death, although was from his stab wounds, would have been avoided if the park called 911 or an ambulance ambulance to take him to the hospital right away. Mel's stepfather, Clarence Reynolds, and his mother, Ellen Reynolds, claimed that Disneyland had a policy of not calling paramedics and ambulances onto park property, and that municipal police or security agencies aren't actually allowed in the park. According to Mel's attorney, if an ambulance was called to transport Mel, paramedics would have given him blood and oxygen, placed him in a pressurized unit to stabilize his heart, and have been in contact with a trauma doctor who would have guided them on what to do more, hence saving his life. In addition, the lawsuit also claimed that Disneyland didn't allow paramedics on its property because it would tarnish the park's perfect image, which was actually confirmed by the nurse Elizabeth Micko, who testified that she decided to take Mel to a hospital herself because of an unwritten policy to not call paramedics into the park. John Doletto also criticized Disneyland security guards for not preventing the fight between Mel and James, and for not discovering that James actually had a knife on him right from the beginning. Disneyland, however, denied these allegations, contending that emergency services in the park were adequate enough. Now, eventually, the jury found Disneyland negligent in Mel's treatment and was ordered to pay $600,000 to the family of Mel. And although the lawsuit ended with a settlement, Mel's, or in this case now James's case, was far from over. It would drag on for another 2 years as James's attorney, Olson, argued that Mel had been drinking heavily and accidentally threw himself on the knife while attacking James. And although Olson agreed that James was found with Mel's blood all over him, he argued that James never actually attacked Mel, saying whatever happened after the fight was unclear. But despite that, after the whole back and forth, James was eventually given a 16-year to life sentence for taking the life of Mel Yorba. And although this lawsuit didn't reverse the damage, it helped prevent future problems like this. And finally, I'm gonna cover some crimes that happened at Starbucks. At around 11:30 AM on January 31st, 2024, a maintenance employee at the Coleman Avenue Starbucks in San Jose was working on the sink in the restroom when he noticed something strange. A small camera was tucked under the sink with the lens aimed directly at the toilet, barely visible unless you're looking for it. Now, the employee didn't touch it, but immediately alerted management, and within minutes, the manager called 911. Now, a few minutes later, San Jose Police Patrol officers arrived at the scene, securing the restroom and ensuring that no one else entered while they waited for specialized investigators. And because of the nature of the incident, the case was immediately transferred over to a special unit, the SAIU. And as they carefully removed the device and began pulling footage from the storage, what they found was worse than anyone expected. The camera recorded from approximately 9 AM to 7 PM the previous day, January 30th, which was 10 full hours of continuous recording. And the footage, of course, shows people washing their hands, adjusting their clothing, and unfortunately using the toilet. All of them recorded without consent and without knowledge, in what should have been a completely private space. Officer Tanya Hernandez, one of the investigators brought in to handle the case, described what they found, saying,
"This recording is graphic and includes multiple juvenile victims fully exposed."
Between January 31st and mid-March, detectives were actively working on identifying the person responsible. They reviewed the Starbucks surveillance footage from January 30th, looking for anyone who used the restroom during the recording window. They also talked to staff members asking about suspicious behavior or anyone who spent an unusual amount of time in a bathroom. They also traced the serial number, purchase history, and identified the storage type to narrow down the suspect pool. They also cross-referenced people who were at the Starbucks that day with databases of known offenders, looking for patterns and connections. And a few days later, the detectives were actually able to trace the act back to one person, a 35-year-old San Jose resident named Luis Juarez Jr. Now, how exactly they identified Luis was never publicly disclosed, but 6 weeks after the camera was found, they had their man. It turns out that on January 30th, 2024, Luis had walked into a Starbucks on Coleman Avenue and in the restroom and installed a hidden camera under the sink, pointed directly at the toilet. And in a single 10-hour window, 91 people used the bathroom without knowing that they were being recorded. The youngest was while the oldest was 85. And when the police finally tracked down Louis and searched his home, they found something that made investigators realize that this wasn't just an isolated incident. A tactical unit specialized in high-risk crime traced Louis to his San Jose home. And while executing the search warrant, they found approximately 20 firearms scattered throughout his home, including an assault rifle, an unregistered weapon, and high-capacity magazines. Now, this would complicate the case even more, since Louis was a convicted felon with a criminal history that should have prevented him from owning any firearms at all, let alone an arsenal like this. But investigators weren't actually looking at the guns, they were looking at the cameras.
They also seized 20 firearms, including an assault rifle, and they say they found several micro cameras. One was hidden inside this tiny toy soccer ball.
There were multiple micro cameras, the kind specifically designed to be hidden in everyday objects and spaces, small enough to conceal almost anywhere, and advanced enough to record high-quality video without being detected. The discovery of those additional cameras confirmed what investigators feared from the moment they found the device at the Starbucks. This wasn't a one-time incident. Louis had been doing this for quite a while. Now, detectives immediately began investigating whether there were other victims in other locations. While Louis was booked into the Santa Clara County Main Jail on March 15th and charged with possession of explicit content involving young people, installment of a hidden surveillance camera with audio, possession of high-capacity magazines, possession of an assault rifle, and possession of an unregistered firearm. And 5 days later, on March 20th, the San Jose Police Department made the case public. They released a statement identifying Louis, outlining the charges, and asking potential victims to come forward. Now, upon learning about the news of Louis' arrest, parents whose children used the bathroom felt sick, and regular customers who stopped in for coffee and used the restroom were horrified, and community members reacted with horror and anger when local news stations interviewed them. One of them, named Alex, said this:
"It is a feeling of being violated, and this is wrong. You know, I'm glad they caught the person, and I hope the hammer comes down hard on them."
Another resident named Marta Gonzalez was visibly shaken when she spoke to the reporters covering the incident. She explained that she and her kids used the restroom frequently, as they were regulars at its Starbucks, and now she has to wonder if her children were among the 91 victims in that footage.
That is just horrible. Like, this is like a community, like everybody comes here, you know, and just to have people looking at you, that's insane.
Now, Starbucks corporate released a statement calling the incident
deeply disturbing,
and they emphasized their full cooperation with law enforcement and their commitment to customer safety. However, for the 91 victims, corporate statements don't really answer the questions that matter. Now, and the case remains open as investigators continue working, trying to identify all the victims, and also analyzing the additional cameras found in Louis's home to determine if other locations were targeted, all while building the prosecution's case to ensure that Louis faces the maximum possible consequences. And while this offender operated in secret, this next case unfolded in broad daylight, inside a Starbucks sitting directly across the street from a police station. Dominique M. Hollom was 30 years old when he walked into a North Olmsted, Ohio Starbucks on a Monday morning, pointed a gun at everyone inside, and demanded cash from the registers. What made his decision even more baffling was the location he chose. The Starbucks sat directly across the street from police headquarters, and within minutes, officers arrived, and what started as a simple robbery turned into a foot chase, 2 gunfight exchanges, a vehicle pursuit, and a 15 to 20 minute armed standoff. It all started on March 21st, 2022, around 8 AM. The Starbucks in North Olmsted, Ohio was busy with the Monday morning rush. Customers ordering coffee before work, employees behind the counter managing the flow. It was the usual early morning routine. Then Dominique walked through the door with a gun in his hand and ordered everyone to the ground. Now the customers dropped immediately, some crouching behind tables and others flat on the floor, while Dominique approaches the counter and tells the employees to empty the register. Now someone actually manages to call 911, and within minutes the police officers arrived to the scene. But as soon as Dominique heard the sirens, he grabbed the bags of cash and ran out the front door. Now this is when the foot chase began. Officers pursued him on foot as he sprinted down Lorraine Road carrying the bags, but the weight just slowed him down, and so as he ran, the bills actually started falling out, scattering across the pavement, and he eventually dropped everything, with the cash register falling onto the street. Now near Dover Center Road and the Brook Park extension, one officer was actually driving slowly, scanning the area, and when he spotted Dominique running past a driveway at Dover Center Road, the officer pulled into the sidewalk and struck Dominique from behind with the front of the cruiser. Now Dominique stumbled forward from the impact, but didn't actually go down. Then he turned back toward the cruiser, raised his gun, and fired 2 shots directly at the windshield. And moments later, the officers were engaged in a firefight with Dominique. Now one officer sustained minor injuries during the exchange, while Dominique managed to take off running again, leaving more cash scattered behind him. Eventually he reached a vehicle parked nearby, got inside, and began speeding off northbound on Dover Center Road. And the officers immediately pursued him through the residential street. Now this pursuit ended when Dominique's vehicle stopped behind a home on Kingston Circle, and the officers surrounded the area, and a few minutes later another exchange of gunfire erupted, and then just a minute later after that it stopped. Thankfully, the negotiators were actually able to convince Dominique to surrender before anyone lost their lives. And once they exited the vehicle with his hands up, the officers immediately moved in to place him in custody. And that was when they actually discovered that he'd been hit during one of the gunfire exchanges. And so to save his life, paramedics transported him to a hospital for treatment while under police guard. Now the next day, the police decided to release dashcam footage showing the moment the cruiser struck him and the moment he turned and fired at the officer inside. And the video shows 2 bullet holes punched directly through the windshield, inches from where the officer was sitting. The authorities also identified Officer Chris Kelly as the officer Dominique shot at during the chase. Luckily for him, Chris walked away with minor injuries. And 9 days later, on March 31st, a grand jury handed down an indictment against Dominique with an extensive list of charges. The indictment covered everything from the robbery itself to the 2 gunfight exchanges, attempted murder, assault on a peace officer, aggravated robbery, weapons charges, and drug possession. And so 8 months later, on November 30th, 2022, Dominique pleaded guilty to every single count. 5 days after that, on December 5th, Judge Shannon Gallagher sentenced him to 18 to 20 years in prison, while the cash he stole was scattered across Dover Center Road and recovered by police. But while Dominique's crime involved a split-second decision to rob a Starbucks and flee from the police, the next case unfolded on a crowded downtown sidewalk, and this time, dozens of people watched it happen. On March 26, 2023, just before 5:40 p.m., the sidewalk outside the Starbucks at West Pender Street and Greenville Street in downtown Vancouver was packed with people. Families, tourists, and shoppers. Everyone was moving through the Sunday evening crowd, and 37-year-old Paul Stanley Schmidt was there with his fiancée and their 3-year-old daughter Erica, pushing a stroller. Now, at the same time, another 32-year-old man named Inderdeep Singh Gozal was standing near the entrance, vaping. And when Paul approached and asked him not to vape in front of his daughter, Inderdeep didn't take it well, and before anyone could understand what was going on, 2 men had started grappling on the sidewalk. Now Paul pushed back, trying to defend himself, when suddenly Inderdeep pulled a folding knife and stabbed him 6 times as they struggled, and his fiancée began screaming in horror as she watched her partner crumble to the ground. But instead of helping, bystanders simply pulled out their phones and started recording. One of those people recording was Alex Bodger, an influencer whose video captures Paul's final moments on the ground, bleeding out on the pavement. And you can hear Paul's partner crying in the background and Alex saying,
"This guy just stabbed him, bro. He's dead. He's dead. He's dead, bro."
Now Vancouver police officers patrolling nearby were flagged down by people in the crowd, and they immediately arrested Inderdeep at the scene and began performing first aid on Paul. Now paramedics then rushed him to the hospital, but later that evening, Paul unfortunately died from his injuries. And the same night, Alex Bodger uploaded the video on TikTok, and within hours, it spread on Instagram, Reddit, and Twitter. Now the next day, on March 27th, Vancouver police publicly identified both the victim and of course the perpetrator, and so Inderdeep was later charged with second-degree murder. He denied bail and was held at the North Fraser Pre-Trial Center. Now a day later, Paul's mother, Kathy Schmidt, would speak to the media expressing her grief about her son's death.
People chose to videotape it and stand by and watch. That's the most difficult thing.
Now she was devastated, not just by her son's death, but by what happened after. She told the reporter that she'd seen her son's final moments captured and shared for the world to consume, and she pleaded with people to take it down, and to respect her family's privacy, and to let them grieve without having to see Paul's death replayed over and over again online.
Please take the video down. Please don't watch it. It's horrific. It's brutal. It's hurtful. Just stop posting it. Stop looking at it. Let us be in peace.
But in response, Alex Bodger simply defended his decision to post the video.
I find street fights pretty cool, so I ran up to take a video. Not really understanding the full grasp of what was happening, I continued to videotape. It really didn't register until the next morning. And so in the moment, it was like, holy crap, I just witnessed this. I didn't fully understand what I just witnessed. And the next morning, I woke up. The screams are playing through my head. It is not doing anybody good anymore. At first it was, you know, it blew up. Everybody knows what's going on now.
Now Vancouver Mayor Ken Sim labeled the incident both awful and tragic, emphasizing that no one should ever feel unsafe walking around the city. And to help Paul's family cope with the loss, a GoFundMe was set through the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Garden Society of Vancouver that ended up racking up almost $200,000. Now for nearly 3 years, the case moved through pre-trial proceedings under a publication ban, and on February 10, 2026, when Inderdeep's second-degree murder trial finally took place in the British Columbia Supreme Court, Inderdeep actually decided to plead not guilty, but the eyewitness report and the evidence against him was too overwhelming, as police had found the closing folding knife on Inderdeep when they arrested him, and lab tests confirmed that Paul's blood was on the blade.
Inderdeep Singh Gosal is facing a charge of second-degree murder in the death of Paul Stanley Schmidt.
Now as of now, the case still actually remains in court, so a decision still has yet to be made. But while bystanders stood frozen in shock during this attack, the next case happened after midnight in an empty parking lot with no witness and no one around to help. On September 20th, 2021, around 12:20 a.m., a San Mateo County Sheriff's deputy was conducting a routine business check in Millbrae when he pulled into a Starbucks parking lot. His headlights would sweep across the pavement, and that's when he would see something strange in the distance. A woman was lying face down on the asphalt, completely unresponsive. Now the deputy called for an ambulance immediately as he approached to check for signs of life, but she was barely breathing and her entire body was covered with severe injuries. Now within a matter of minutes, paramedics arrived, and transported her into the San Francisco General Hospital. And upon arrival, doctors began treating her for what they describe as multiple organ injuries consistent with being run over repeatedly. Now the next day, on September 21st, investigators identified the victim as Griselda Joseph, a 53-year-old homeless woman who frequented the area. She was kind of known to spend time in the Starbucks parking lot and regularly visited the Safeway supermarket across the street from the same store. Now to get to the root of the matter, detectives immediately began reviewing surveillance footage from the nearby businesses. Now they didn't release the video to the public, but what they saw told a horrifying story. That fateful night, the CCTV captured a gray BMW SUV accelerating towards Griselda as she walked on the sidewalk. Now the car struck her and sent her belongings flying, and then it ran her over again and again. Now the same morning, a deputy searching the area spotted a gray BMW SUV parked in front of a residence on Henry Place, less than half a mile from the Starbucks. The car had damage consistent with a recent collision, and so the detectives contacted the owner on the spot, whose name was Garrett Young. He was 23 and lived at the same residence where the vehicle was found. And because that seemed kind of suspicious, they did an interview, and during it, the detectives pieced together the connection between Garrett and Griselda. It turns out that Garrett worked at the Safeway supermarket directly across from the Starbucks, and his job duties included cleaning the store and collecting shopping carts. Now Griselda regularly came into the market, and over several months, she'd repeatedly yell at Garrett. She actually complained that the bathrooms weren't clean to her liking, and criticized his work in front of other customers and employees. She was, by multiple accounts, consistently kind of mean to him, and so over time, the repeated yelling from Griselda built up an insane level of resentment in Garrett. He couldn't handle the constant criticism and complaints, and so just after midnight on September 20th, he decided to do something about it. He got into his BMW, drove to the Starbucks parking lot where he knew that Griselda spent time, found her, and ran her over. Then he drove home where he lived with his parents, parked his car in front of his house, and went inside as if nothing had happened. Now detectives of course immediately placed Garrett under arrest and booked him into the McGuire Correctional Facility on an attempted murder charge. Almost immediately, Garrett's defense attorney raised concerns about his competency to stand trial because Garrett actually has documented developmental disability.
KTVU legal analyst Michael Cardoza says the fact that the defendant may be disabled won't absolve him of liability in this case.
There are plenty of people with mental defects that are law-abiding citizens, so that will not be an excuse.
And so the court actually suspended the criminal proceedings to actually do a competency evaluation and brought in 2 independent doctors to assess Garrett's mental state to determine whether he was fit to stand trial.
Now today, in fact, a judge suspended criminal proceedings after the defense questioned their client's mental competency. That means he will now be evaluated by 2 doctors. Now meanwhile, the victim's prognosis is grim. If she dies, this will likely turn into a murder investigation. Now the defendant still is being held without bail.
Now 2 weeks after the attack, Griselda actually died from her injuries. She'd been fighting for 16 days, but the trauma from being run over multiple times was simply too severe. And her death actually changed everything, as the charge against Garrett was now upgraded from attempted murder to simply murder. And so on December 15, 2021, the competency evaluation results came back, and both independent doctors reached the same conclusion. Garrett was not competent to stand trial due to his disability. Now the media coverage of the incident pretty much died after that, so it's not really clear whether Garrett ever got sentenced, but we can pretty much assume that he got away with it. And while Garrett's case had more questions than answers, this next case started with something even more ordinary than a dirty bathroom complaint, a credit card that got declined and ended in tragedy. Pedro Jose Garcia was a 34-year-old man with a rap sheet stretching back to 2001, which includes charges of stolen vehicles, felony assault, burglary, drug stealing, and weapons possession. He'd been in and out of prison for over a decade. It's September 25th, 2016. The Starbucks at 7260 South Rainbow Boulevard in Las Vegas was filled with weekend customers when Pedro pulled up to the drive-thru window and handed over his card to pay for his drink. Now the employee ran it twice, but both attempts came back declined, and when the employee asked if he had another way to pay, Pedro's demeanor shifted almost immediately, and he began to argue with the employee through the drive-thru window. Customers waiting behind him started to notice the delay as the tension built, but the employee actually kept her composure, calmly explaining that she cannot hand over the drink without the payment. But Pedro's voice only grew loud, and eventually he pulled away from the window, but instead of leaving, he drove around to the back of the Bank of America next door, parked out of sight, and walked back into the Starbucks to confront the employee.
So police tell us that it starts at this drive-thru window. The suspect trying to pay for a drink, but his credit card was denied.
A 41-year-old man named Alexander Kutschivili was present at the scene, and as he saw the argument escalating, he decided to defuse the situation. Now the customers began edging away, instinctively sensing the danger, and at that moment, Pedro pulled out a gun. Now instantly, panic erupted as people dropped to the floor and scrambled behind chairs and tables, while the employees ducked behind the counter. He fired into the ceiling, shouting and waving the weapon. Now Alexander was still standing, still believing he could talk Pedro down, but it unfortunately didn't turn out as he planned. Pedro said,
"Go for it, dog. I'm not gonna tell you again. Play cowboy with me, dog."
Then Pedro would aim the gun directly at Alexander's chest and fire. Now he would collapse, with blood spreading across the floor. And so at 11:26 a.m., multiple 911 calls flooded into dispatch, and police were sent to the Starbucks immediately, treating it as a possible hostage situation. But while officers were racing to the scene, Pedro made another call to 911 himself. He gave a fake description of the shooter, lying about what the suspect looked like, what they're wearing, and where they went. He was trying to misdirect investigators, sending them looking for someone who doesn't actually exist, while he blends in with the victims. And so when the officers arrived, they evacuated everyone outside. And as customers and employees filed out, Pedro simply walked out with them, pretending to be just another terrified witness. And for a while, the officers couldn't actually identify who was behind the shooting due to the conflicting stories. But as officers actually interviewed people at the scene, their stories didn't match with the 911 call Pedro made. And after matching the stories and tracing the suspected call, they managed to identify Pedro in the evacuated group and took him into custody. Now inside the Starbucks, paramedics were working on Alexander, performing CPR and trying desperately to save him. They then transported him to the Spring Valley Hospital Medical Center. But unfortunately, at 12:49 p.m., less than 2 hours after the gun attack, Alexander was pronounced dead.
Metro says it started after an argument escalated between two men. The suspect shot the other man in the chest. Witnesses inside that Starbucks tried to save that man. As they attempted CPR, he died later at a local hospital. Meanwhile, parents waited. Thankfully for Kim Plank, she received a call early, relieved her 20-year-old daughter was safe.
So my daughter called, and she works the drive-thru at Starbucks, and she said guy came in with a gun, she got down, and then when she had a second, she jumped out the window of the drive-thru.
Now after police took him into custody, Pedro actually told them that there was a bomb in the backpack he'd left inside the Starbucks, and the bag was kept at the doorway while he'd walked out and blended into the crowd. And so federal agents were called in and a bomb squad arrived, as nearby businesses were told to evacuate from the crime scene, and people were moved to shelter-in-place positions while bomb technicians deployed a robot to examine the backpack.
A potential bomb threat that has since been cleared and an alleged hostage situation. Police say calls came in about this being a hostage situation because of the way customers and employees were describing it to 911.
But of course, when the bomb squad eventually opened the bag using the robot, they of course didn't find any explosive device inside. So at 2:13 p.m., more than 3 hours after the gun attack, the scene was declared safe. And the next day, September 26th, Pedro Jose Garcia was booked on a lengthy list of charges, which includes open murder with a deadly weapon, robbery with a deadly weapon, burglary while possessing a weapon, and discharging a gun at an occupied structure. However, because of his criminal history, he was also charged with possession of a gun by a prohibited person. Now, it nearly took 2 years after the gun attack, on August 2nd, 2018, that Pedro was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 14 years.
Tonight we're learning Cucciavilli, who friends called Sasha, was a regular at this Starbucks. Police reports now showing why investigators say Pedro Garcia shot him. Police say Garcia called them during the shooting. He told police Cucciavilli appeared to be reaching for something. On the phone, police can hear a man moaning in the background as Garcia shouts, "Go for it. I'm not going to tell you again. Play cowboy with me."
He was sent to Southern Desert Correctional Center to begin serving a sentence, but his time in prison was actually way shorter than anyone expected. On January 15, 2023, Pedro actually died, and the coroner ruled it as an accidental methamphetamine intoxication. Now, how he obtained the drugs inside the facility was never publicly disclosed, but the Southern Desert Correctional Center did have a documented drug smuggling problem at the time, so we can kind of connect the dots. But while Pedro's violence erupted inside the Starbucks for everyone to see, the next case started with someone who simply didn't show up for their shift, and by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Whitney Heichel was just 21 years old, working as a barista at a Starbucks in Gresham, Oregon. She'd recently married her husband, Clint Heichel, and the two were living together in an apartment in the Rockwood area. They were actors of the Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall in Gresham, where friends described Whitney as warm, dependable, and deeply committed to her faith. She was in the first year of marriage, working early morning shifts and settling into adult life with the man she just promised forever to. But everything was about to change, because on October 16, 2012, at 6:45 6:45 a.m., Whitney left her apartment to drive to her 7 a.m. shift at Starbucks. It was a routine morning drive that should have taken less than 10 minutes, one she'd made countless times. But unfortunately, she never actually arrived at work. At around 7 a.m., her shift started without her. Her boss waited, assuming she was running late. But as the minutes passed and Whitney still hadn't shown up or called, concerns started building. And about an hour later, her boss called Clint, Whitney's husband, to ask if he knew where Whitney was. But Clint was immediately alarmed because he'd seen her leave the house for work. So he tried calling her phone, but there was no answer. He then sent texts, but still got nothing back. And so finally, at 9:56 a.m., an hour and 40 minutes after her boss first checked in, Clint decided to call 911 to report Whitney missing. And detectives began working immediately, checking surveillance footage and trying to trace her movements from the moment she left home. At 12:30 p.m., they then got their first significant lead. Whitney's ATM card had been used at 2 different gas stations in the Troutdale area, within 8 minutes of each other. Someone was using her card, and now the question was whether it was Whitney or someone else. Now 30 minutes later, the police then found Whitney's black Ford Explorer SUV in the Wood Village Walmart parking lot. The front passenger side window was smashed, and the vehicle was empty. Some of Whitney's personal items were then recovered from a trash bin near the Walmart, though the police didn't specify what those items were. Now the discovery of a vehicle confirmed everyone's fear. Whitney had been taken by somebody, and so the next day the police started spreading pictures of her across local news. And they also put together a search party as volunteers combed areas near where her SUV was found, including Dodge Park and Larch Mountain. Now investigators had previously noticed mud on the tires and believed that whoever drove it had taken it through those areas. Now the same day, investigators flagged a 24-year-old man down named Jonathan Holt. He was a person of interest. He lived in Whitney's apartment complex and attended the same congregation. And when they finally tracked him down on October 19, he agreed to sit for an interview. And during that interview, Jonathan told the detectives that he'd actually been mugged by 2 men the previous day. He described the incident in detail, explaining how it happened, what the men looked like, and what they took. But the detectives immediately noticed inconsistencies in his story. The details simply didn't add up, and his timeline shifted when he was questioned again. The story simply felt rehearsed, but poorly executed, like someone trying to create an alibi without thinking it through. And because of those inconsistencies, detectives asked Jonathan to submit to fingerprint and DNA analysis, and he actually agreed, likely believing it would clear him and make his mugging story more credible.
And they say Holt's interviews with detectives didn't add up.
During this time, we obtained DNA and fingerprints from Holt.
Now on October 18, at around 5:30 p.m., 2 children actually found Whitney's cell phone in the bushes near the Troutdale Terrace Apartments area. And the mother of one of those girls, April Fletcher, picked it up and saw Whitney's face on the screensaver. She recognized her from the missing person coverage and immediately reported it to the police. But everything came to a halt on the night of October 19, when the authorities found Whitney's body on Larch Mountain, about a 40-minute drive from her home in Gresham. Now around the same time, the DNA analysis Jonathan Holt agreed to came back, and his fingerprints and DNA matched the ones the officers found inside Whitney's SUV.
This is what Whitney Heichel's family and the entire community had feared most, and police say the man who murdered Whitney was not a stranger. He lived in her apartment complex.
And so he was taken into custody for investigation of aggravated murder. 3 days later, on October 22nd, prosecutors then filed major charges against Jonathan. 7 counts in total, including kidnapping, robbery, intimate violence, and murder. Because after conducting an autopsy, the medical examiner confirmed that Whitney's cause of death were multiple gunshot wounds. And so all these charges directly reflected what Jonathan confessed to doing before he shot her. And the next day, on October 23rd, a court document laid out the sequence of events based on Jonathan's eventual confession.
We just got this minutes ago from the Sheriff's Office, and the probable cause summary from the Sheriff's Office says Jonathan Holt admitted under questioning to a state police sergeant on Friday details of Whitney's murder and that he assaulted her.
Apparently, Jonathan had waited outside Whitney's apartment the morning of October 16. When she came out to leave for work, he approached her and asked for a ride. And Whitney, trusting him as a neighbor and fellow congregation member, said yes. Now, about 5 minutes into the drive, Jonathan decided to pull out a handgun and forced Whitney to drive to Roseland Lake, a remote area where he knew they'd be alone. Then he forced her to perform an intimate act and then shot her 4 times. Now after killing her, Jonathan threw his phone into Roseland Lake, trying to eliminate evidence that would place him at the scene. He then moved Whitney's body to Larch Mountain, choosing an even more isolated location where he believed she wouldn't be found. He then drove her SUV to the Walmart parking lot and smashed the passenger window to make it look like a carjack. He used her ATM card at the gas station to further muddy the timeline, and then went home and simply waited. And when the police started investigating, Jonathan inserted himself into the case, volunteering to give information and telling the mugging story to explain any evidence that might tie him to, but his dies of course collapsed after the DNA evidence sealed his fate. And so on July 8, 2013, Jonathan pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and the plea counts included 3 counts of aggravated murder, 1 count of first-degree kidnapping, and 2 counts of first-degree robbery.
I'm sorry, but at the same time I know that that doesn't mean anything. accept full responsibility for what I did and whatever punishment is given to me because of my selfishness. I have stolen a daughter, a sister, and a wife.
Now, Whitney's family expressed relief that Jonathan pleaded guilty, sparing them a trial where they'd have to hear every detail and see every piece of evidence and pretty much relive the trauma over and over again. And while Jonathan's case stretched across 3 days of searching and unanswered questions, the next case involves a killer who vanished before the police even arrived. It's 4 p.m. on January 14th, 2024. The Starbucks Coffee Ion Town Kawanoya store in Shigokocho, Ehime Prefecture is open for business on a Sunday afternoon. Families were inside ordering drinks, and the outdoor terrace seating area was occupied by customers enjoying the mild weather. Now, Yuichiro Ishikawa is a 49-year-old high-ranking member of the Ikeda Gumi, a designated organized crime group in Japan, and he's sitting outside at one of the terrace tables. The man that approached him fired directly into Ishikawa's chest at close range, and customers inside the Starbucks heard the gunfire, and the staff immediately called emergency services. Now, immediately the man left the scene before the police or anyone could actually stop him, and a few minutes later officers arrived only to find Ishikawa bleeding heavily from his chest, and while the paramedics transported him to a hospital in an attempt to save his life, his injuries were simply too severe. The next day, January 15th, the police announced that Ishikawa had died from blood loss. And so now the focus was who was behind this attack and what was the reason for it. And so investigators reviewed the Starbucks CCTV footage, and they found video evidence showing the man pretty clearly. They captured his face, his clothing, and his movement during the gun attack, and they were able to almost immediately identify the person. It was a man named Yushiro Matani, and so the police obtained a warrant and publicly named him as the murder suspect. And they also issued a nationwide wanted notice warning the public that Matani may still be armed and dangerous.
今日午後、四国中央市の商業施設で男性が拳銃のようなもので撃たれ、その後死亡しました。男性を撃った男は現在も逃走中で、警察は殺人事件として行方を追っています。
Now, the description released to the public includes specific identifying details: his clothing at the time of the gun attack, his facial features, and something particularly distinctive. He had missing fingers on his left hand, a detail often associated with Yakuza members who've undergone yubitsume, a ritual finger amputation, as an apology or show of loyalty within organized crime groups. Now, the police stated that they believed that there was a personal dispute between Mitani and Ishikawa, but they didn't elaborate on what that dispute involved or how long it had been ongoing. Now, a week later, on January 22nd, police conducted a search connected to Mitani's organized crime ties, and he was actually described as an executive member of the Ikeda Gumi, a designated Yakuza group, and so officers searched the Ikeda Gumi office in Okayama City, hoping to find him or just gather information about his whereabouts, but he wasn't there. Now, by this point, the police had received about 160 tips from the public, but none of them actually led to Mitani's capture. He's been on the run for over a week now, and despite the nationwide alert, he's managed to stay hidden. Now, 3 weeks would actually pass, and by February 14th, the tips had increased to around 280, but Mitani was still at large. Now, the police continued issuing public warnings and appeals for information, because the longer he remained free, the more concern would build about where he might be and whether he's still out. And when they still didn't locate him 6 days after, on February 20th, police released a public information video designed to help citizens identify Mitani if they encounter him. Now, this video features his photo from the CCTV footage, details about his physical characteristics, including his height of 5'4", the missing fingers on his left hand, and illustrations showing possible disguises he might use, such as masks, glasses, or hats.
愛媛県警が公開したのは30秒の動画です。動画では殺人容疑で公開手配している岡山市の特定抗争指定暴力団池田組の幹部前谷雄一郎容疑者の特徴などを紹介しています。
And this video again spread across Japanese media, as news outlets ran coverage of the manhunt. And thankfully, this actually helped, because 2 weeks after the video release, on March 5th, at around 6 AM, investigators finally located Mitani. He was at a private residence in Okayama Prefecture. And once they confirmed his location, officers moved in and took him into custody on suspicion of murder, ending the nearly 2-month manhunt.
前谷容疑者の乗った車が入ってきました。四国中央署に今移送されました。
And when the police questioned him, Mitani refused to answer any questions about the gun attack, about his whereabouts during the manhunt, or about why he actually killed Ishikawa. However, during the search of the residence where Mitani was found, officers discovered a firearm and live ammunition, which they believe may have been used in the Starbucks killing. And so 3 weeks later, on March 26th, prosecutors indicted Mitani for murder at the Matsuyama District Court. And a week after that, on April 3rd, police formally rearrested Mitani on new charges. Now, in Japan, each charge actually requires its own arrest warrant, transferred and detention cycle. So even though Mitani never left the cell, the legal process actually required a fresh arrest to pursue the firearm violation separately. This time it was for violating Japan's firearm and sword possession control law, which prohibits virtually all civilian gun ownerships. Also in Japan, even possessing a single unlicensed firearm is a pretty serious criminal offense, carrying up to 10 years in prison. But the longer the case went, the more it expanded beyond just Mitani. On May 8th, the police arrested a 59-year-old construction worker named Ryuji Doi for harboring Mitani during the manhunt. It turns out that Mitani had contacted him personally, telling him that he'd know where to go, and Ryuji agreed to help him. He hid him for over a month, and so on July 19th, Ryuji was sentenced to 18 months in prison. But the judge actually suspended the sentence for 3 years, which meant that Ryuji walked free on the condition that he stayed out of trouble. And so even if he commits one more offense within those 3 years, he would go straight to prison to serve every day of his sentence. Now, as of the most recent updates, Mitani actually remains in custody awaiting trial, and no sentencing date had been publicly confirmed yet. And the Starbucks we're talking about actually reopened after the gun attack. But the incidents of course left a mark on the community. But while this gun attack involved organized crime and a manhunt that stretched across the entire country, the next case is even worse. On October 1st, 2025, at 10:30 am, 2 men walked into a Starbucks in Laval, Quebec during the morning rush, but they weren't actually there for coffee. Surveillance footage showed them moving directly toward a specific table where 3 men were sitting. They knew exactly who they were targeting, and seconds after, they opened fire.
2 individus qui font éruption se dirigent vers le fond de la salle et ouvrent le feu faisant...
One of the men sitting at the table was Charalambos Bobby the Greek Theologu, a well-known gang member in the city, and he was already hit multiple times, and his 2 companions, believed to be members of his gang, were also shot. Now within seconds, the shooters turned and ran out of the Starbucks. They disappeared into the plaza, leaving only chaos behind.
Several shots are fired. The 2 men then turn and run out.
Now at 10:35 am, just 5 minutes after the gun attack, Laval police received multiple 911 calls, and they dispatched their officers immediately. And when they arrived, they found 1 man dead, 2 others wounded, and a Starbucks full of traumatized witnesses. Now the police set up a large security perimeter around the entire plaza and told the public to avoid the area completely. And to get to the root of the matter, forensic teams moved in to process the scene and interview everyone who was inside. Now shortly after the shooting, Quebec's public security minister, Ian Lafrenière, released a statement revealing that the information available led him to believe that the incident was linked to organized crime, and that he doesn't believe that there were innocent victims among those people shot. Now the next morning, on October 2nd at 3 am, the police received a 911 call reporting a vehicle on fire in a parking lot on Joliot-Curie Street, near Clement Dader Avenue, in Montreal's Rivière-des-Prairies, Pointe-aux-Trembles neighborhood. And upon learning about the blaze, firefighters quickly arrived at the scene to, of course, extinguish it. And this is where they immediately noticed signs of accelerant, a substance used to aid the spread of fire. And so they notified the police, who passed the case to arson investigators. And later that day, the police stated that the burnt vehicle could be actually linked to the Laval Starbucks gun attack, though they publicly didn't confirm who owned the vehicle or how exactly it was connected. But the implication was clear. The shooters likely used the vehicle to flee, then torched it to destroy the evidence. Now the same day, the surveillance video from the Starbucks was released publicly, and it shows the 2 suspects entering the area, moving directly toward the victim, and then running out as customers and staff take over. And on October 3rd, Quebec's coroner office confirmed the identity of the man who died, as again mentioned, the widely known gangster known as Bobby the Greek. He was somebody who actually had a criminal history which included drug trafficking, weapons possession, and conspiracy. He'd already served 4 years in prison for conspiracy and aggravated assault in 2007, and was even sentenced to 5 years in prison in 2010 for drug trafficking. Now one of the wounded men were also identified as 45-year-old Elias Hodges, who was allegedly known to be Bobby's right-hand man. But as for the other wounded man's name, it was never actually publicly confirmed. But he of course was most likely also connected to Bobby and his criminal operations.
Now, the person who appears to have been the main target was shot and killed, a man in his 40s known on the streets as Bobby the Greek. 2 men with him were injured in the attack. They're believed to have been acting as bodyguards.
But even after 4 months of intense search, the perpetrators of the attacks still haven't been identified. And while these gun attacks happened quickly and the shooters fled immediately, the next case involves a man who died on his birthday over a laptop. It's December 31st, 2019 at 11:37 am. A young man named Shu Zheng is working on his laptop at a Starbucks in Oakland's Montclair district, located on the 2000 block of Mountain Boulevard. It's his 34th birthday, and he's planning to celebrate with friends that evening and ring in the new year. Now, Shu is an engineer and research scientist at Aspra, an IBM company based in Emeryville, and he often comes to the Starbucks to work. But outside the building, a car is slowly circling the block. Inside is 22-year-old Byron O.J. Reed Jr. behind the wheel, while 18-year-old Kedron Wiggins is in the passenger seat, and 21-year-old Javon Lee is keeping his eyes fixed on the entrance, serving as a lookout. Kedron stepped out, walked straight into the Starbucks, and snatched the laptop from Shu's table before he could actually react and bolted back to the car. Now Shu jumped up immediately and chased after, and he wasn't thinking about any danger. Instead, he simply ran out of the Starbucks and saw Kedron getting into the getaway car. Now Byron started driving, trying to pull away before Shu could catch up, but Shu was way faster than expected, and he reached the car and grabbed onto the door handle, clinging to the vehicle as Byron accelerated. Now despite that, Byron didn't stop. Instead, he kept driving, speeding up even, trying to shake Shu off. But Shu just held on, his body half on the car, half dragging along the pavement, all while he kept screaming at them to stop, desperate to get his laptop back. Now as the car sped up, Kedron kicked Shu off the vehicle, and in an instant, Shu hit the ground, and Byron drove right over before crashing into a parked vehicle on the side of the road. Now the impact was brutal, but Byron wasn't done. As Shu lay on the ground, Byron actually ran him over again with the getaway car and crushed him with the car before speeding away. Now witnesses who saw the thing unfold immediately called 911, and within minutes paramedics arrived to transport Shu to the hospital. But his injuries were absolutely catastrophic and he was barely clinging on to life, and sadly later that evening Shu died from his injuries at the hospital. Now the police responded to the scene and began reviewing surveillance footage from the Montclair Village Association camera network, and the footage they were able to get their hands on showed the getaway car circling before the theft, the laptop snatch inside the Starbucks, and the chase outside that ended with Shu being run over. Now, investigators immediately identified the vehicle, and it didn't take long for them to trace it back to a home in the 9400 block of MacArthur Boulevard in Oakland. And so at around 4 p.m., just hours after the incident, the police arrested two suspects at an address described as Byron's sister's residence. And so Byron O.J. Reed Jr. was charged with murder and second-degree robbery, while Javon Lee was charged with involuntary manslaughter and second-degree robbery as well. Now this news actually hit the Montclair community hard, because Shu wasn't just a random victim. He was a regular at that Starbucks. People knew him to be quiet and always focused working on his laptop, and now he was dead because 3 men wanted to steal it. And so on January 5th, 2020, a vigil was held at the Montclair Starbucks as friends, co-workers, and community members gathered to remember Shu. Now on January 31st, 2020, exactly 1 month after the theft, the police arrested the third suspect, which was Kedron Wiggins, who was actually the person who grabbed the laptop inside the Starbucks. And so 2 days later, on February 3rd, 2020, prosecutors filed charges against Kedron as well. And on January 7th, 2022, Kedron was then sentenced to 12 years in prison, and Javon was sentenced to 10 years. But Byron's sentencing actually took longer, because his case kept moving through the courts for years because it involved additional factors, such as murder committed during a robbery. But finally, on June 25th, 2025, more than 5 years after Shu's death, Byron was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. But while this case ended with a man who made one split-second decision that cost him everything, the final case started with 3 employees dead over a safe that was never actually opened. It's July 6, 1997, and Georgetown is absolutely packed. Tourists are everywhere celebrating the 4th of July weekend in Washington, D.C. The streets are loud with excitement and restaurants are filled, and the Starbucks at Wisconsin Avenue is about to close for the night after a busy shift. Now 3 employees are inside, cleaning up and getting ready to go home, none of them knowing that within the next hour, they would be dead. One of them is Mary Catherine Mahoney, known as Katie, a 25-year-old night manager at the Georgetown Starbucks who started as a barista and worked her way up to being trusted with the keys and the safe. She was looking forward to celebrating her birthday 16 days later, after attending her brother's wedding that summer, and that night she was closing the store with 2 other co-workers. Emery Ellen Evans, also 25, had been at the store for months, knew the routine well, and joked around with Katie during cleanup. They've pretty much become friends over the shifts they've worked together. And then there was Aaron David Goodrich. He just turned 18, fresh out of college, and he picked up this job trying to make some money over the summer before heading off to college in the fall. He had his whole life ahead of him. Now at 8 p.m. the doors were locked, and the 3 employees remained inside to complete their usual closing duties, cleaning and restocking for the morning crew, for example. And it seemed like an ordinary night. Now the next day around 5:15 a.m., day shift supervisor arrives to open the store, and to her surprise, she sees Katie's car outside, and the lights and music are still on. Now the pastries are neatly set out for the morning rush, yet the store doesn't look properly closed or even clean, and so she thinks of course that Katie's still around, and so she walks towards the back room to see what is going on, and that was when she found them. All 3 employees were lying on the floor in the back of the room, fatally shot, with Katie still clutching her keys as if she tried to escape. And so the supervisor ran outside and flagged down a passing bus, and the driver immediately called the police after hearing reviewing what had happened. Now by dawn, the Metropolitan Police Department sealed off the scene, while detectives began processing what will become one of the most infamous murder cases in Washington, D.C. history. Now the crime scene didn't make immediate sense. Investigators found a shoe print near the front door that didn't match any of the victim or their day managers. Ballistics testing showed that 2 different guns were used during the attack, a semi-automatic and a revolver, which at first led detectives to consider the possibility of more than one shooter. There was also a bullet hole in the ceiling near the safe, appearing to be a warning shot meant to intimidate. But here's what didn't actually make any sense. The cash drawers were completely untouched, and there was no sign that the safe had ever been opened. If this was supposed to be a robbery, why was nothing taken? And so the detectives considered the possibility of this being an armed robbery gone wrong, or a hate crime against one of the employees. And so they investigated a recently fired Starbucks employee who had inside knowledge of store operations and closing procedures, but he was actually cleared after questioning. Now there were no security cameras inside the store, and no alarms were ever triggered during the attack. And so Starbucks corporate headquarters, along with local businesses, decided to offer a reward for information, and this amount rose rapidly, eventually reaching $100,000, making it one of the largest rewards in DC history at the time. But despite the intense media coverage and hundreds of tips from the public, no solid lead emerged, and the case eventually went cold. Then on September 27, 1997, a couple of months later, homicide detectives received an anonymous phone call, and the caller described a man named Carl. He had a thin build, and he was in his mid-20s, living in Gallatin Street in Northeast DC with his mother, his wife, and a young child, and driving a blue car. He was supposed to be the man behind all of this. Now investigators began cross-checking records and identified this person as Carl Derek Cooper, and his criminal record was actually pretty long and serious, including armed robberies, firearm offenses, auto theft, and drug charges. He appeared to fit the profile, but there wasn't actually enough evidence to arrest him for the murders. Instead, they simply placed him under surveillance, monitoring his home and tracing his phone calls, and just slowly building up a case. And over the next year and a half, they did actually link Carl to a growing pattern of armed commercial robberies across DC and Maryland. And informants told them that he routinely carried 2 guns when he committed his crimes. He also ran a robbery ring, and witnesses reported that he used intimidation shots during robberies, firing into walls or ceilings to scare the victims into compliance, just like the shots fired in the Starbucks ceiling. But still, they couldn't arrest him. But on March 1st, 1999, nearly 2 years after the murders, Carl Derek Cooper was finally arrested, but it wasn't for the Starbucks. He was arrested for an attempted robbery and attack of an off-duty police officer named Bruce Howard that happened back in 1996 in Prince George's County, Maryland. Now Bruce survived the attack, but that case actually gave investigators the legal leverage they desperately needed to bring Carl into custody. And the moment that Carl was behind bars, the real interrogation began. And so on March 2nd through March 4th, 1999, Carl went through a 54-hour interrogation involving detectives from MPD, the FBI, and Prince George's County Police. Now he was given his Miranda rights repeatedly, and he also signed multiple waivers acknowledging that he actually understood those rights. Now they administered a voice stress test with the results showing clear deception when he denied any involvement in the Starbucks murders. And the story that he told them actually changed consistently, shifting every time detectives poked holes in his alibi. Now first, Carl pointed fingers at Keith Covington, his childhood friend. He claimed that it was an inside job and that Keith planned and executed it alone, but there wasn't any confirmed evidence of any close relationship between Keith and Emery Allen Evans. But despite that, detectives brought Keith in for questioning, and he admitted that he was familiar with Emery, but he denied any involvement in the murders. He also provided a solid account of where he was at the time and passed every test they gave him, ultimately clearing himself. But Carl didn't stop there. He changed his story yet again. This time he admitted that he was inside the Starbucks that night, but he insisted that Keith was the one who actually fired the shots. But the detectives confronted him with the inconsistency, laying out the evidence in front of him, such as the ballistics reports, the robbery patterns, the witness statements, and the timeline, all showing that his story didn't actually add up. And finally, after 54 hours, Carl's story finally collapsed. He admitted the truth. He said that he was outside the Starbucks on the morning of July 6th, sitting outside and watching the employees through the window, and then waited until after closing when the store would be nearly empty. He entered alone, carried the 2 guns in his waistband, and demanded access to the safe, believing that it held thousands of dollars from the busy holiday weekend. But Katie actually refused to hand over the keys, so he fired a shot into the ceiling to frighten her into cooperating. But it didn't actually work, and so he decided to shoot all 3 employees. Katie was shot 5 times while still holding the keys when she fell, and apparently trying to unlock a door and escape. Aaron was shot once, the bullet passing through his lungs and heart, and Emery was on the ground and shot execution style while kneeling. Then Carl decided to flee the scene without actually taking any money from the registers, leaving only 3 victims in the back room. He then later said that he went home, changed his clothes, and washed them to remove the blood and residue, and then buried both firearms in a plastic bag near St. Anne's infant home. Now the guns were never recovered despite the extensive searches of the area, and so on March 5th, 1999, Carl Derek Cooper was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree felony murder. murder. And on August 5th, 1999, he was indicted on 48 separate federal charges, including the Starbucks murders, the Bruce Howard gun attack, and multiple other armed robberies and firearm violations spanning from 1993 all the way to 1998. Now, Carl actually later attempted to revoke his confession, claiming that the interrogation coerced him into saying this stuff.
I swear on my father's grave and my son's life, I didn't do Starbucks.
But on April 25th, 2000, facing the possibility of the death penalty under the federal charges, Carl actually pleaded guilty and formally accepted sole responsibility for the Starbucks murders. He was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. And now in January of 2002, the case was featured on the FBI Files television series in an episode titled The Coffee Shop Murders, bringing the story to a national audience. And in July of 2022, on the 25th anniversary of the murders, Starbucks actually had a memorial ceremony for Katie Mahoney, Emery Allen Evans, and Aaron David Goodrich at the Georgetown location. Now, Carl Derek Cooper remains in federal prison today, where he will spend the rest of his life. Now, somewhere near St. Anne's infant home, the two guns, and Carl Derek Cooper knows exactly where, but he hasn't disclosed the location yet, and probably never will.